On a Monday afternoon in early December, I received a call that changed my life. When I answered the phone, the man asked, "Is this Alan Baxter?" "That's true. Can I help you?" He said, "Lisa Baxter's husband." A little worried, I replied, "Yes, is something wrong?" He said, "Sorry, I'm calling to tell you about your wife's inappropriate relationship with a man at Extra Point." I was initially stunned and then annoyed that I had received an obvious prank call. "Who the hell are you and why are you telling me this crap?" He said, "This is not bullshit. Your wife is meeting another guy on Friday night at the disco." I knew it wasn't true, not my wife, but an unpleasant feeling came over me. Something was happening, something I didn't understand. I needed to think. But I needed time. "I'm not alone. Can you call me back in 20 minutes? He said, "Okay," and hung up. I stood with the phone in my hand. My arms and legs began to shake. I felt a cold sweat break out. My heart was racing, but my thoughts were like molasses. I sat down and put my head in my hands. There can't be anything wrong with that, can there? I was married to Lisa for 6.5 years. We have a beautiful 6-year-old daughter named Maddie, who is the center of our world. And yes, Maddie came a little early. Lisa was pregnant when we got married. We met during fall semester at a local college. Lisa was a first-year nursing student. I completed a 2-year degree in business and accounting, but lost my draft deferment because I was 5 credits behind where selective service regulations said I should be. Even though I lived at home, I worked full-time every other semester to pay my tuition. Vietnam was in full swing, and of course, the draft board was not sympathetic. I just hung around college, taking a couple of classes, but mostly playing cards with my buddies in public places, expecting my draft notice to show up any day. To tell the truth, I was an indifferent student, and I was bored with school. I had some money in the bank. I was young, naive, and thought that leaving home and going out into the world wouldn't be such a bad thing. One of the guys I was playing cards with nudged me and said, "Look at this," and pointed to the line for the cafeteria. There stood a girl with long brown hair, a short skirt, and magnificent legs. He said, "This is Lisa Hartwell. She was 2 years behind us in high school." As I studied her, I thought, "Damn, she's cute." As soon as she sat down, we walked over, and he introduced me. The three of us sat and talked for a while. They both grew up in the same area and mostly talked about their old gang while I listened and admired the view. Finally, she said that she had to go to class, smiled at both of us, and left. I was immediately attracted to her. She was about 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighed 115 pounds, and had the body of a dancer. Long and slender. It turned out that dancing was her hobby, and she performed in a couple of school musicals. She was not a beauty in the classical sense, but she was attractive and sexy. She had a wide smile, an easygoing personality, and obvious sex appeal. She would talk to anyone and could instantly make you feel like she was interested in you. In high school, you could say I was part of the nerd crowd, not very sociable and had difficulty making new friends. I read a lot, but got mediocre grades. I was not lazy, so I always had a job, and I was proud that I had my own money and my own transport. Other than one girl I dated for a few months my freshman year, I only dated a few times. I was tall, 6'3", 195 pounds, wore glasses, and looked pretty average. I was interested in sports, but I wasn't very good at it. I never learned to dance, I didn't have an expensive car, and I never played sports. Comfortable talking to girls, so I never attracted much attention to myself. During my freshman year of college, I dated a girl I met at my summer job. She was pretty, smart, and a second-year student at a nearby university on a scholarship. She was also very religious. Dancing, drinking, or sex were not part of her belief system. After that, besides school and work, my social activities revolved around hanging out with the guys, beach parties at the lake on the weekends, if the weather allowed, the occasional poker night, and college kedgers. I kind of got into partying more than was good for me. I know that over the weekend I had seizures when I came home in the early morning. A few days after meeting Lisa, I saw her sitting alone in the common room, so I walked over to her table and sat down. We talked for a bit, and I really felt an attraction. She told me about her decision to become a nurse, having worked in hospitals since she was old enough to deliver candy. She lived at home to save money as her father was disabled. We talked about our families and just hit it off. Finally, I asked her if she wanted to go to a movie and pizza with me the following weekend. She said she was free on Saturday. I said, great, and we'll pick her up at 7. This is where it started. After our second date, we parked on one of the country roads and kissed. A couple of weeks later, I was at her house, and we started getting to know each other. Her parents had already gone to bed, but it was a small house. I suggested we go for a ride, so we drove to a secluded forest a few miles away from here. There we made love. After that, I was hooked. I confess. We talked on the phone almost every day, went out on dates once or twice a week, and almost always ended the evening making love. And it wasn't just sex. I didn't know if it was love, but it was close. One of my friends, who had his own apartment, allowed me to use it on weekends when he went to his parents'. We made love 3 or 4 times a night before I had to take Lisa home. I wasn't her first, but she said the only guy she'd ever had before me was in Florida over spring break. A few weeks later, at the end of the school semester, the draft notice arrived almost simultaneously. I had to report to the recruiting center in 30 days. Lisa burst into tears when I told her about this and said that she loved me. Until that moment, I had avoided the word love, but I had to admit that I probably loved her too. A week before I was due to leave, Lisa and I were sitting, and she seemed nervous. "Alan, I need to tell you something. I'm late for Women's Day." I thought, oh damn, neither of us brought it up, so I assumed she was safe and on the pill or something. I just sat there trying to find the words. Lisa looked at the floor and tears streamed down her face. I felt so sorry for her that I hugged and kissed her. After a while, she calmed down and we began discussing our options. For some reason, neither of us mentioned marriage. We decided that if she was truly pregnant, we would either get rid of the pregnancy or keep the baby and give it up for adoption. Anyway, one of Lisa's brothers and his wife lived in Alabama, so she thought she could go live with them for a while. She might be able to hide the pregnancy from her friends and the rest of her family. I said that this was probably the best option. I had some savings, and as soon as the army money started coming in, I could send her more. Neither of us were happy that night, and I drove her home without the usual passionate ending to the evening. A couple of days later, Lisa went to the doctor and confirmed that she was pregnant. We made preliminary plans for her to move south after I left for the army. I gave her almost everything I had in the bank, which, together with her savings, should have been enough for her needs. We spent the last evening before I left, making love again and again in quiet desperation. When I took her home, Lisa snuggled up to me and whispered, "I'm so scared, Alan. I love you more than anything in the world." When I left, I felt as depressed as I had ever felt in my life. About 6 hours later, I and a couple hundred other nervous, sleep-deprived, and, in many cases, hungover guys showed up at the recruiting center. After processing the paperwork, we were sworn in, given a lunchbox, loaded onto buses, and sent on a 10-hour trip to Fort Knox, Kentucky. We got off the bus around midnight when we were greeted by the shouts of half a dozen serious drill sergeants. We were quickly ushered through the linen line and directed to the old World War II barracks to sleep on bunks that were probably as old as the barracks. During the Vietnam War, basic training in the Army included about 1 week of paperwork and orientation, followed by 6 weeks of military training. This was followed by additional training in the chosen specialty or the one that the Army chose for you. Basic training included all the usual things everyone has heard of: physical training, marksmanship training and qualifications, obstacle courses, drill, navigation, map reading, hygiene, and a variety of other necessary military topics. I learned that the secret to successfully completing basic training was to keep your mouth shut, follow orders, and sleep when you got the chance. We were always exhausted due to the high pace and tension. I was a couple years older than the average recruit and had 2 years of college. Therefore, I was appointed squad leader after the first one burned out in the second week. He suddenly had the realization that he was a pacifist and against war. I think this realization came to him a little late. Meanwhile, Lisa wrote to me every day. The most important part of each day was the mail. One thing can be said about the Army: it never stopped a soldier from receiving his mail. She wrote to me over and over again how much she loved me and told me how her move to Alabama was going. Or, more precisely, how it's not moving forward. She wrote that her daughter-in-law wears the pants in their family and is not very cooperative. She did not want to interfere in our problems and tried to convince Lisa to tell everything to her parents. Lisa's parents always treated me well, but they were real smoking, beer-drinking factory workers from the outback. Her father, brother, and brother-in-law were addicted to alcohol, cheated on their wives, fought with anyone, anytime, and if they didn't abuse their children, they at least neglected them. Her mother and sisters spent most of their time trying to keep up with their men. Lisa was the youngest in the family and seemed to have escaped the worst influences of her family. She never liked beer and quit smoking as soon as she found out that I didn't like girls who smoke. But somehow I was haunted by the feeling that if they found out that she was pregnant about me, nothing good would happen. As the weeks passed, I became completely absorbed in preparation. But every night I was haunted by letters from Lisa, who became increasingly desperate about the pregnancy. Between basic training and her letters, my stomach was constantly in knots. I often wrote back to her and called her when we were allowed to use the phone. Lisa continued to try to negotiate with her daughter-in-law, but to no avail. At that time, if your training went well, each company was promised a 48-hour rest after the fourth week. And so, on Thursday, we were told that we would be released on Friday evening, and we would have to return only on Sunday evening. However, the conditions of the day off stated that you could not move more than 50 miles from the base, otherwise you would be considered to have left the unit without permission. There were 6 guys in our platoon who lived in the same county and wanted to go home to see their wives or girlfriends. We chipped in to rent a car and hit the road. It was more than 500 miles to home, not 50. After 8 hours of driving, I was dropped off at my parents' house around 2 in the morning. I slept for 6 hours and then went to Lisa. Her parents went to the lake where they had a trailer so we could be alone. When she saw me at the door, she burst into tears and hugged me as if she thought she would never see me again. We went to her bedroom, took off our clothes, and made love. We talked, made love again, and talked again. It got to the point that her daughter-in-law finally refused to help Lisa, and she was already almost 10 weeks pregnant. When we made love for the last time that morning, Lisa cried and said, "I don't want to get rid of our baby." This made me stop halfway. I realized that I only had one option left. I realized that I couldn't leave her. Finally, I said, "Lisa, do you want to marry me?" This was far from the most romantic proposal, but I saw no other way out. She wiped away her tears and whispered, "I don't want you to feel like you have to marry me." I assured her that this was what I wanted and that it would be the best solution. Even though I was afraid of it, I told her that I would tell my parents before I left for Fort Knox the next day. She had to tell her parents and start planning the wedding. I said that any decisions she made regarding the organization would be accepted by me without objection. But we couldn't set a wedding date until I knew where I was going after basic training. With the decision made, we were able to relax a little and think about what it meant. Was it love? I think yes. I knew I wanted to be with her, and that's all that mattered. The next morning, I caught Mom and Dad before they left for church and told them the hardest part. What made this conversation easier was that my older brother got married 2 years ago when his girlfriend got pregnant. The situation was tense for some time, but then the parents reconciled and everything somehow worked out. When the child was born, all was forgiven. I need to say a few words about my family. My father was a mid-level manager in production, and my mother was a housewife and worked part-time as a teacher's assistant. Everything was quite good for them financially. They always had a decent house and could provide us, 4 sons, with everything we needed. They were active church members and participants in parent-teacher meetings. While I was growing up, my brothers and I were forced to attend church every Sunday. As soon as I was old enough to get a job, I realized that if I worked on Sundays, I could avoid going to church. That's why I always tried to work on this day. They did not smoke, rarely cursed, and drank. Family came first for them, and we never doubted that they loved us. When I told them that Lisa and I were going to get married, they had been through this before. Mom simply asked, "Do you have to?" "No, Mom, but Lisa is pregnant." Dad just looked gloomy and Mom shook her head. "Have Lisa call me this week and we can discuss your plans while you play soldier." Then they went to church. I visited Lisa again to spend a couple more hours with her and then met up with the guys for the ride back south. Before completing basic training, I received orders to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for additional individual training. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that I should undergo 8 weeks of practical training to become an assistant in the post adjutant's office. I always thought it was because I had 2 years of college and could type. The best part about this was that I could take up to 7 days off before starting a new position. I called Lisa and asked if this was enough time to organize the wedding. Lisa, her mother, and my mother have already prepared everything. We had a nice church wedding, not too big, with a reception after the ceremony. Lisa was a wonderful bride. The dress she chose was loose enough to hide her developing baby bump. Her father provided us with a keg of beer, and most of her relatives were drunk by the end of the evening. Lisa and I had a 3-day honeymoon, and then I boarded a plane to Fort Polk. We decided that Lisa would stay with her parents until I completed my training and received a permanent assignment. She also decided not to return to college and returned to work at the hospital, where she took a job as a junior administrator. Fort Polk was a real shithole. It was recently reactivated as an infantry training base due to Vietnam. It was hot, humid, and the cockroaches were the size of your thumb. But I worked indoors in an air-conditioned office, mostly as a typist clerk and errand boy. My time there passed quickly. 6 weeks later, I received orders to go to Germany at the end of my training. I couldn't believe my luck. Most of the guys after training were sent to Vietnam. I had some time before my new assignment, so I was able to spend 10 days at home. Lisa was 6 months pregnant, but still damn attractive and constantly wanted intimacy. My plan was to request maternity leave as soon as I reported to my new duty. Lisa planned to stay with her parents until the last month of pregnancy and then move in with my parents. They had a few extra rooms that were better suited for her and the baby. I flew to Germany and was assigned to a position as a maintenance clerk in an armored unit. It was another hands-on training, but it seemed easy. We were stationed at a small base near the East German border. This was at the height of the Cold War, and our unit's main mission was to patrol the border, which we did about 1 week out of 6. Over the next few months, I tried to keep things organized. I flew home a couple of days before Lisa's due date. She was huge. 4 days later, labor began. Everything went well, and soon we had a beautiful girl whom we named Madeline. When I first looked at her, I realized that my life would never be the same again. I spent the week after her birth enjoying every moment. We planned for Lisa and the baby to come to Germany as soon as Maddie was old enough to travel. Finally, everything came together, and about 3 months later, I met my family at Frankfurt Airport. Living in Germany as an ordinary soldier with a family was not easy. I was not entitled to military housing, so we rented an apartment in a small village, about 10 kilometers from the base. I bought an old Volkswagen Beetle convertible that had the body painted 3 different shades of blue and was probably on its 5th or 6th engine. Our furniture was old and worn, thrown out of military housing or left behind by other soldiers who were leaving. We didn't have a TV, just a multifunction radio. My salary was barely enough for basic needs, with a small reserve to go to the movies once a month. Gasoline was cheap, so most weekends we drove around the German countryside. Our only entertainment is ourselves. Maddie was a miracle. She was almost always happy and slept 10 to 12 hours a day. Lisa was a great mother, And of course, she spent the whole day with her daughter. But when I got home, I spent almost every waking minute of Maddie playing with her. When she was sleeping, Lisa and I were busy with each other. Our evenings were like the honeymoon we never had. For 10 months, except for the weeks when I had to go off on border patrol, we made love almost every night and in every possible way. I got to know Lisa's body better than my own, and what a body it was. After Maddie was born, she quickly regained her figure. Her hips were a little more rounded, her breasts a little fuller, although she still complained about their small size. But there was not a single stretch mark or spot on her body. It wasn't just sex. It seemed like we knew each other so well that we could finish each other's sentences. When we looked at each other, we almost always knew what the other was thinking. We never really fought, sometimes we disagreed, but we never got angry. We discussed everything. What we wanted from life, what we wanted from Maddie, what we were going to do when we got home. We took care of each other and tried to make each other happy. The emotional connection we built convinced me that this was forever. I couldn't imagine my life without her, and I was sure that she felt the same. When my time in Germany was coming to an end, I was offered a promotion if I agreed to continue my service. But we both wanted to return to the world, be close to family and friends, go back to school, start a career, move on with our lives. It was a great experience, and I was proud of my service, but it was time to move on. What a relief it was to return home after 2 years away. We lived with my parents for several months until we got back on our feet. I found a temporary second-shift job at a local auto plant and re-enrolled in college. Between veterans' benefits and jobs, things should have worked out for us. We bought a used car, rented a townhouse, and collected furniture from a variety of sources, family and friends. Living with my parents placed serious restrictions on our sex life. But when we moved into our own place, everything got better again. We never got back to the honey rush we had in Germany, but it was still pretty great. 2 to 3 times a week has become our usual frequency. We continue to enjoy love in many different ways. We have always been tender to each other. They held hands as they walked together, often caressed and hugged each other, and often cuddled on the couch while watching TV. From time to time, we brought up the topic of having another child, but neither of us was ready for it. We used to go out to rock clubs near campus with a few pairs of friends about twice a month. I must say that for me to dance, it took a lot of alcohol and a lot of people around who were also dancing. So after a few drinks, Lisa took me to the dance floor, and we really got into it. Slow dancing didn't bother me. Being around Lisa, having her on the dance floor, was an inspiration to me, and it made me better than I already was. But in fast dancing, I was an ordinary guy with white skin, with a small set of movements and a poor sense of rhythm. But Lisa could rock the place. She was typically dressed to kill and looked so hot she could make a grown man cry. After a night at the club, I usually couldn't wait for her to be home and in bed. In the following years, I continued to attend college part-time and worked various jobs. Within a couple of semesters, I completed my associate's degree requirements and transferred to Michigan State University to pursue my undergraduate degree. I worked a few temporary second-shift jobs during the winter months, but during the warmer months, I primarily worked for a few construction firms. Strangely, I realized that what I liked best was working on construction sites. Working outdoors, operating heavy equipment, and doing physical labor brought me a lot of satisfaction. I met several other veterans at school who were doing much the same thing as me. John and Craig were best friends and even served as best men at each other's weddings. We were all married and had small children. We started hanging out with a few other couples from time to time. Barbecues, pool parties, cooking competitions, mostly family events. Craig worked for a construction company owned by his wife's father, and John worked for several large construction companies in the area before and after his service, so he knew the construction business well. One day, he approached me with a proposal. We could put down a couple $1,000s each and register a construction company. We would combine his experience with mine, as well as my education in business and accounting. He proposed to do mainly landscaping of the territory and possibly underground work at the initial stage. We could contract with several building contractors, including Craig's company. The idea of working for myself attracted me, and the opportunity to earn serious money was even more attractive. Lisa and I discussed this and decided to give it a try. Lisa took care of the children in our home until Maddie was 4 years old and started preschool. She then decided to return to work at the hospital. But basically, we lived from paycheck to paycheck. We had moved several times and now lived in a nice duplex. We had our own furniture, a 3-year-old car, and a 4-wheel drive pickup truck. That was almost all we had. The work was interesting, and we were busy for about 8 months of the year. We hired 4 to 5 people to work on projects as needed. Living in the snow belt brought most excavation work to a near standstill when the ground froze. But we received unemployment benefits during the winter months and did some cash work, so we were never poor. And of course, I was still receiving some VA benefits for tuition. At first, John and I used to go to happy hours at various bars after work on Fridays for a few drinks. We were usually joined by a crowd of other builders, including Craig. John and Craig turned out to be pretty serious beer drinkers. I was happy with the slight inebriation after a couple of cocktails. It also turned out that both of them were quite active players when given the opportunity. I was shocked to learn that John regularly slept with one of the wives in our social circle, and Craig had an affair with the sister of one of the guys from our company. His greatest achievement, he said, was getting his wife's younger sister laid off in the first year of their marriage. Both of them freely admitted that they had tried to seduce almost every attractive woman they knew, and quite a few who weren't. Often, after a few drinks, they would brag about their exploits. I admit that these stories sometimes piqued my interest and made me wonder what it would be like to experience something new. From time to time during these happy hours, I would meet other women, have a drink with them, or even dance with them. But when I compared them to Lisa, they simply couldn't compare. I didn't see the point in taking the risk when I had something better at home. I always looked forward to coming home to my wife. Around the time we started the business, disco was finally making its way to the Midwest. Our rock clubs gradually disappeared. Lisa completely immersed herself in the new music. Her dance experience allowed her to quickly master all new dances. By the beginning of our second year in business, many of the rock bars had disappeared and discotheques had taken their place. I went with Lisa to such establishments several times, but I just couldn't get into it. It was not only that I had no talent for dancing, but also that I did not feel comfortable in this environment. I was the guy who preferred flannel shirts and jeans over silk shirts and John Travolta-style suits. I had been working in construction for several years, and at 6'3" I weighed about 230 pounds. I was a big guy, but with a lot of muscle. I had broad shoulders and chest and big arms. In the off-season, I went to the local IMCA, where I played racquetball and did weightlifting to keep in shape. I had long hair and a full beard. Lisa said I looked like Paul Bunyan, and Maddie thought I was just a big teddy bear. But Lisa was completely different. She only became more beautiful with age. She could eat whatever she wanted and not gain an ounce. Lisa loved beautiful things and was a real fashionista. She could wear anything and still look sexy. One of the few things we argued about was how much she spent on her clothes. With her looks, talent for dancing, and charming personality, she fit perfectly into the disco atmosphere. Since I had no interest in disco, Lisa started going to clubs once a week with a few friends from work. They drank, enjoyed the music, and sometimes danced a little. This turned into me coming home from happy hour with the guys on Fridays around 7 or 8 in the evening, and Lisa would go meet her friends at one of the clubs for the rest of the night, and I would stay home with Maddie. Around the same time, when Lisa became interested in discos, she started thinking about breast augmentation. One of our old neighbors, about her age, had this surgery, and Lisa was fascinated by how it changed her figure. I didn't think it was necessary and argued with her about it. But Lisa insisted that she considered herself flat, and that after the operation she would look better and feel more confident. Our insurance covered the hospitalization, but did not cover the surgeon. Besides, it was not an expense we could afford. But she persistently pursued her goal, and in the end, she had the operation. The changes were not significant. Her breast size increased from 34B to 34C, but she looked really great, and she was really happy with the result. The construction season has come to an end, and we have completed our second full year in business. I worked from home, closed accounts, prepared tax returns, and reporting forms. We've been busy for 8 of the last 12 months, made a profit, paid all our bills, and had some money in the bank. But when I added up all the hours John and I put in for the year, we only made about 50 cents an hour. It certainly wasn't the big deal I was expecting. Lisa and I were discussing buying a house. We are tired of renting a house. Maddie was 6 years old and starting first grade. And again, there was talk of getting her a brother or sister. Lisa did a good job at her job at the hospital. She changed positions several times, received promotions, and increased her salary each time. In truth, her income was probably more than my combined income from work, unemployment benefits, and VA benefits this year. I was starting to wonder where our construction business was going. I only had a few courses left to complete my bachelor's degree. Maybe you should think about doing something else. And then, right after Thanksgiving, I answered that anonymous call that changed everything. As I sat there trying to cope with the nausea, all this kept popping into my head. I kept muttering to myself, "What the hell?" I didn't want to believe that there might be some truth in this, but something inside me told me that I was missing something. Something has changed this year. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. I needed a plan, and I needed to be ready for when he called again. I took a notepad and started making a list of questions that I needed answers to. After a while, I just sat there and stared at the piece of paper, hoping it would all just go away. When the phone rang, I was startled. I grabbed the phone and said, "Hello? Are you alone now?" asked the voice. "Yes. Your wife Lisa goes to Extra Point on Fridays, doesn't she?" the caller asked. "Yes, yes. She's been dating a man there named Dan Burris for a few months now." Damn, when he said his name, it seemed more real. "How do you know?" He chuckled. "They don't really hide it. Their whole company is aware of what's going on." Damn it. My thoughts raced between disbelief, anger, panic, and denial. "Why are you telling me this? Are you mad at this guy, and that's why you made this up? Or did you try to hit on Lisa, and she rejected you?" He got angry at this. "I'm not making this up. And it's none of your business why. Just thought you should know." "Yes, of course," I answered after a short pause. "When and where does this happen?" "Most often they get out into his minibus somewhere between 11 and 12. He has a real bedroom on wheels there. They usually don't come back to the club." With an unpleasant feeling, I remembered waking up and hearing Lisa coming home after 2 in the morning a couple of Fridays, and then I just went back to sleep. Later, when I asked her about it, she simply shrugged and said that she stayed for the band's last show. "How long has this been going on?" "I heard that it started around midsummer, maybe earlier." "Is this Dan married?" "Yes, but he says his wife doesn't mind." "Do they meet somewhere else or something else?" "Several times they didn't stay in the parking lot after they left the club. I heard him say that they went to his house one day and they met for lunch a few times." He paused, then added, "And there was also a weekend on a sailing yacht." "Weekend on a yacht? What are you talking about?" "It seems that one weekend in August, Dan, Lisa, and 2 other couples went on a large sailing yacht to Lake Michigan. I heard they had a lot of fun there." Damn it! It's like a big puzzle, and one piece fits together to form the whole picture. In August, my parents asked me to come to their dacha by the lake and help build a terrace. Lisa had to work at the hospital on Sundays, and she usually worked one Sunday a month. It happened to be her shift that weekend. I left on Friday night and took Maddie with me. Mom and Dad were always happy to see their granddaughter. Lisa said she planned to go to the beach in Grand Haven on Saturday with a friend named Connie, who also worked at the hospital. She also mentioned that she might be staying the night at Connie's and driving from there to work on Sunday morning. Can't be. Lisa is afraid of water. She barely agrees to set foot on a pontoon boat. Maybe they never left the marina, but whatever they did, I heard it was a great party. The awareness of the possible consequences of this story began to penetrate my consciousness. If this is true, then Lisa lied to me, and if she lied about that, what else could she lie about? Where does this Dan Burris live? Oh no, I'm not going to be responsible for you doing something stupid. Besides, his number is in the phone book. What does he look like? He's about 6'1" or 6'2". Probably weighs about 180 pounds. He is 32 years old and has blonde hair combed back. Good physical shape, good dancer, decent looking, a real seducer, and earns a lot of money. Anything else you know about them? Well, from what I've heard, I have a feeling he's not the first. She is quite popular in their circle, but now Dan is taking all her attention. And to be honest, she's the first person he talked about as the woman he's in love with. Damn, he's talking about my wife. I started to feel nauseous. I said furiously, I can't believe this. Lisa is not like that. Hey man, I'm sorry to hear this, but if I were you, I'd like to know. And he said this with some degree of sympathy, which only made me feel worse. Yes, of course, and I hung up the phone with a bang. I don't know how long I sat there, but the next moment Maddie was already returning from school. I came to my senses a little to hug her tightly and praise her for the drawings she brought from school. In the end, I sat her down with a snack and cartoons in front of the TV, watching her. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I began to think about what might await us. Is it really possible that Lisa could be involved in something like this? Lisa was supposed to return home in a couple of hours. While preparing dinner, I replayed this conversation in my head over and over again. The caller knew too many details to ignore. I decided I didn't want to have a confrontation just yet, partly out of fear of the unknown, partly out of hope and prayer that this is all just a misunderstanding. But whatever it was, I had to find out the truth. As I thought about the call, I began to think about what had changed in the last year or two. Lisa has always been a little flirty. She communicated with anyone and was not shy. She loved dirty jokes as much as anyone we knew. I know she likes attention from other men. We discussed and laughed about this many times. I never believed that anything could come of it. When I was drinking with the guys, the conversation about sex always started sooner or later. Lisa was probably one of the most beautiful women in our group. A couple of times, when the guys were tipsy, I heard hints and rumors about her flirting and indirect references to the fact that she was allegedly cheating. I always attributed these comments to alcohol and jealousy. Maybe there was something more behind this. Another thing I noticed was that when Lisa first started going clubbing with her friends, she would always be back before midnight. Sometimes I was still awake, and she wanted to make love. Sometimes she even woke me up. If we didn't make love when she got home, we probably did it in the morning. But when she started coming back later and later, all this stopped. We no longer made love on Saturdays. Sunday has become the norm. In fact, she rarely got up before 11 on a Saturday unless I was working, and she had to keep an eye on Maddie. Another thing I've noticed over the past year is that Lisa has become significantly more confident than ever before. Maybe it had something to do with her improved figure or the way she started dressing more professionally in line with her latest promotion at work. And she, it seemed, was no longer as interested in trips to my parents' dacha as before. I had the feeling that she was less interested in what I was doing and how things were going in the construction business. One of the things I did while waiting for Lisa to return was get out the phone book and look up Dan Burris' number. I found a record of Daniel and Patricia Burris in Grand Ledge, a nearby affluent suburb. When I saw this post, a chill came over me again. I wrote down their number and address, collected all my notes from the call, and put them in my briefcase. I put on a mask and tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened that day. Somehow I survived the evening. Lisa was as affectionate as always. She kissed me when she walked in the door. I kept looking at her, trying to see if I was seeing something different, but I didn't notice anything. She chatted about her day in the hospital and about our friend's upcoming Christmas party. She laughed and played with Maddie. Maddie wanted to put up a Christmas tree, and we tried to convince her that it was too early for that. Later that night, I just lay in bed, trying to forget everything. Lisa hugged me as usual and immediately fell asleep. The next morning, after Maddie left for school and Lisa left for work, I took out my notes. I reviewed everything again and collected all my thoughts. I decided that I needed to search the house for evidence. I went through Lisa's closets and chests of drawers. I went through our boxes of stuff in the basement. I checked our old credit card bills, phone bills, and checking statements. Nothing suspicious. I looked through our folder with correspondence, note cards, all kinds of small pieces of paper, and again found nothing. But then I took our address pad that we kept for contacts and started looking through it. Nothing caught my attention until I got to the Z section. Like most people, we didn't know anyone with a last name starting with Z. However, on the second blank page after the letter Z, I found about half a dozen pencil notes in Lisa's handwriting. They were just initials followed by one or two phone numbers. One of the entries was DB, and the first number matched Dan Burris' number listed in the phone book. It was like a punch to the stomach. I just sat and looked at this page, feeling despair overcome me. At first I felt angry. Then came sadness and depression. As incredible as it may seem, I was forced to admit that my wife led a secret life that I didn't even know existed. A life that may have included behavior completely contrary to our marriage vows. And she cared so little about me that she even wrote down the evidence in our shared address pad. I was forced to believe that the story the unknown caller told me was mostly true. And if this is so, can I close my eyes to it? Will I be able to forgive her? I realized with horror that we would probably never be able to go back to the way things were before. What about Maddie? Whatever happens, she will suffer the most. With the evidence I had, I knew I could figure out who, what, and where. But I could only find out why through direct confrontation with Lisa. I had 3 days left before she went to the club again on Friday. I had to get as many answers as possible before this time. I should have known my options, and I had to be ready to make a decision and follow it. I couldn't let this drag on. It was eating me up from the inside. I had a high school friend who graduated from law school. He clerked for a local judge while waiting to take the bar exam. I called him and he referred me to a divorce lawyer who would provide me with a free consultation. I made an appointment for Friday morning. I started calling the numbers found in our address pad to see who else might be involved. It was easy. I could pretend I had dialed the wrong number or pretend to be a salesperson over the phone. I was right about the second number under the initials DB. It was the number of an office equipment service company. Judging by the secretary's words, Dan was a sales representative. The rest of the names associated with the numbers were unfamiliar to me, except for CM. It turned out to be the number of her friend Connie from the hospital. That evening, I told Lisa that I needed to visit a construction site that we were going to apply for, and I would be back in a couple of hours. I drove to the Burris house and parked a few doors down. It was a comfortable residential area. When I arrived, there was one car in the driveway, a brand new BMW. About 20 minutes later, a burgundy Chevrolet minibus drove into the house. A well-dressed man, matching the description of Dan Burris, got out and walked into the house. Now I could relate the name and the face. I drove past slowly and wrote down his car number. Getting through the rest of the week was not easy. I avoided going to bed when Lisa went to bed. Just the thought of making love to her made me depressed. Lisa sensed that I was tense and kept asking if everything was okay. I told her I was feeling pressure to finish my tax forms early and balance my accounts. She accepted my version without comment. In fact, neither the IRS nor my partner John cared if everything was filed by April 15th. I tried to spend as much time as possible with Maddie. I was afraid of the changes that might happen in the future. At dinner Thursday night, Lisa casually asked, "Are you going to happy hour on Friday as usual?" As I walked, I answered, "I don't know. For some reason, I don't feel like it this week." Maybe we can skip this Friday and do something together. Maybe the three of us can go somewhere." Without blinking an eye, she replied, "Darling, it's too late to change plans. I promised Connie I'd meet her at the club. She will bring a friend whom she wants to introduce me to. This friend is interested in a vacancy that has opened in our hospital." I just sat there and felt so depressed. She stooped to this. "Make up stories so as not to miss a meeting with your lover." My feelings probably showed on my face. "Oh, Alan, we can do something together on Saturday or Sunday. It's not the end of the world," she laughed. I smiled and said, "You're right. It's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world, but it might be the end of our marriage." On Friday morning, I met with a lawyer and explained my situation to him as I saw it. I needed to know what my legal options were. His first question was, "Is reconciliation possible?" I replied that this was possible, but everything would depend on what would come out of the upcoming confrontation. He explained that we lived in a no-fault divorce state. This means that the reasons for the divorce are not relevant to its approval. The reasons may be important when dividing property, assigning alimony, and determining child custody. Given that Lisa's income is equal to or greater than mine, alimony should not be an issue. Since our assets were minimal, dividing the property should not pose a problem. Regarding custody, if it comes to divorce, I would like to get joint custody of Maddie. In the event that Lisa decides to contest this, evidence of her infidelity or her unfitness as a mother could dissuade her from doing so. I told the lawyer that I could provide something to back it up. When I returned home, I began to feel the need to share what was happening with someone. I needed someone who could convince me that I wasn't exaggerating, that it really was as bad as I thought it was. I was too embarrassed and confused to tell anyone in my family. I thought about John and Craig, but given their attitude towards fidelity, I doubt I would get good advice from them. Besides, I couldn't trust them not to spill the beans after a few drinks. My plans for the evening were already set, so after completing some accounting work, I headed to the bar for happy hour. My thoughts were far away, and after one drink, I switched to ginger ale and just watched everything happening around me. The view was depressing. Is this really what awaits me? Hanging out in bars looking for company. Marriage has brought me a lot of good things. It has made me happy. At least I thought everything was fine. It turns out I was blind. In the end, I gave up and went home. I pulled up to the house before 7 o'clock and Maddie greeted me at the door, jumping into my arms and hugging me tightly. "Dad, Dad, you're home." Lisa came out of the bedroom, dressed but still finishing her makeup. She looked at me carefully, as if trying to figure out if I was sober. I fed Maddie dinner, leftovers on the stove. "I'll meet Connie for dinner before we go to the club." I just mumbled in response and headed towards the kitchen. Maddie chatted about school and showed me her drawings while I heated up my dinner. As I sat there with Maddie, Lisa came into the room wearing a coat, looking beautiful as always. My heart sank in pain when I thought about what she was doing to us. She kissed us both and said, "You two have fun today, love you both." Maddie replied, "I love you, Mommy." I just said, "Bye." I wanted to ask her to stay, but it would be pointless. Lisa stopped at the door for a second and looked at me with a strange look, as if she wanted to say something. Then she opened the door and went out. I waited about 15 minutes, listening to her car drive away, and then called the babysitter I had arranged for in advance. I told her to come in 20 minutes. Then I sat down with Maddie and said, "How would you like Carol to come and sit with you for a while?" Maddie adored Carol and happily agreed. "You have to be a good girl and go to bed when she tells you to, okay?" Maddie nodded vigorously. I went into the bathroom and got out my shaving supplies. I started shaving my beard and mustache. Where I was going to go tonight, I didn't want to be recognized. Maddie came in and looked at me. "Dad, what are you doing with your face?" "I'm making it smooth like it was before you came along, darling. Do you like it?" I grew a beard right after I got out of the army, and she didn't remember me without it. "I think so," but she sounded unsure. My hair was still long, but I combed it back and out of my face. I gathered the things I would need, and as soon as Carol arrived, I said I had to leave, but would be back between 11 and 1 in the morning. I kissed and hugged Maddie and left. I went to my brother's house to change vehicles. He asked a few weeks ago if he could borrow a pickup truck to move some things. A couple of days before, I told him that he could take it that Friday night if he would let me use his car. This suited both of us. He was also something of an amateur photographer, and I asked him to lend me a camera and a zoom lens with film that would work in low light. He asked what I was going to film, but I just said I'd tell him if it worked out. He set everything up and gave me some tips, and then I was on my way. It was snowing when I pulled into the club parking lot around 8:30. I drove through the parking lot until I came across her car in the very corner, in a dark place. I didn't see the burgundy van, so I thought they might still be having dinner. I hoped they didn't decide to go elsewhere. I parked where I had a clear view through the side window and waited. About 30 minutes later, the van pulled up with another car behind it. Both cars parked next to Lisa's car. Lisa and Dan got out of the van, and the other couple got out of the car. I didn't know the man, but I recognized the woman. It was Connie. Lisa introduced me to her a couple of times. She was a pretty blonde, divorced, and a couple of years younger than us. Lisa and Dan walked holding hands, laughing and talking, looking at each other with obvious tenderness. I took a couple of photos as they walked past me towards the entrance. Watching them, I felt sick to my stomach again. I waited a few minutes and got out of the car. I dressed differently than usual, khaki pants and a shirt. He threw on a long dark raincoat with a raised collar and a Panama hat. I decided that if I kept my head down, the visor would hide my face. The disco crowd dressed quite eclectic, so I thought I wouldn't stand out if I stayed in the background. I hung the camera around my neck and hid it under my coat. I walked up to the entrance and paid for admission. I walked straight to the bar, looking out from under the brim of my hat just enough to find my way. I bought a Coke and started looking around. I thought that if they came to dance, they would be close to the dance floor and the DJ. I noticed them ahead. They pushed a couple of tables together and sat with 6 or 8 other people. I made my way around the crowded bar, trying to stay close to the wall. I found a table with one bar stool against the wall about 30 feet behind them. It had a good view of their table and dance floor. I wasn't worried about being recognized. The only lights in the club were on the dance floor and bar, making it almost impossible to see anyone in the distance. It was obvious that they all knew each other. The women were hugging and kissing on the cheeks, and the guys were laughing and joking. Besides Lisa and Dan, I only recognized Connie. I wondered if someone from this company was the one who told me everything. The music played, and most of the group took to the dance floor as a couple. For the next 3 hours, I watched Lisa and her lover. Within the first hour, it became clear that the word lovers accurately described their relationship. They danced, kissed, and hugged. They whispered in each other's ears. They danced together as if they had been partners all their lives. God knows how many hours they must have practiced fast dancing. In slow dances, they literally merged in their arms, as if they were one. I saw Lisa look into his eyes, as she had once looked into mine. I just sat there, choking with a lump in my throat, constantly wiping tears from my eyes. As they sat at the table, he kept his hand on her leg, and she slowly stroked his hair, her wedding rings glinting in the light, as if mocking me. As the evening went on, they became more and more affectionate, and I knew how it would end. They were in their own world, sharing their innermost thoughts. After 3 hours, I was emotionally exhausted. I intended to follow them to his van and witness how the evening ended, but I couldn't take it anymore. I had an answer, and it was bitter. It was not just a physical relationship, but also a deep emotional connection. What I thought we had, what I thought we shared only with each other, she freely gave to him. She has already left me. I realized that there could be no satisfactory explanation, no satisfactory solution to this situation. I've seen enough, and I secretly took enough photographs to prove to myself later, or to anyone else, that it was not a figment of my imagination. I took a piece of paper out of my pocket and wrote on it in my bold handwriting, which she instantly recognized. "Don't come home today. I don't want to see you. The doors will be locked. Go to your mom, your sister, or stay with Dan. It doesn't matter anymore. Don't call me today. I won't talk to you now. Call tomorrow. If you have something to tell me tomorrow. I carefully folded the note. I got up and walked over to the bar. I stood there for a few minutes and watched blankly as Lisa and Dan began to put on their coats. A waitress walked by and I said, "Do you want to make $20 in tips?" She looked at me like I was crazy. I continued impatiently, "See that woman near the dance floor in the green dress and black coat? Oh, of course it's Lisa. I know her and her boyfriend too." Disgusted, I said, "Great, just great. Here's $20. Just go and give her this piece of paper." She took the paper and a 20, looked at me, shrugged and headed towards the dance floor. I walked up to the exit, turned and watched, numb, as the waitress walked up to Lisa and handed her a note. Lisa said something to her, and the waitress answered something and pointed to the bar. Lisa unfolded the sheet of paper and one of her hands rose to her lips. I could almost hear her scream over the loud music. She then slowly sank to the floor as her stunned lover tried to keep her on her feet. I turned wearily and walked out into the cold, snowy night. When I drove home, I could barely see the road through my tears. It was the saddest day of my life. Everything I believed in was destroyed. Lisa was everything I needed, and I was once everything Lisa needed. Why has everything changed? Was all this just a fairy tale? Were the signs always there, and I was too complacent and too caught up in my own world to see them? I got home before midnight. I paid Carol, thanked her, and sent her home. I looked into Maddie's room and was again struck by how beautiful and special she was. I tried not to think about what the next days or weeks would bring. The phone rang and I unplugged all the cords from the sockets, bolted the doors, and went to bed. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep instantly. Surprisingly, I slept for about 7 hours and felt better than I deserved. Maddie would probably sleep for at least another hour, so I began my preparations. I knew I was in for another grueling day. Around noon, I plugged my phone back in. A few minutes later, it rang. When I picked up the phone, I heard Lisa's voice trembling. "Can I go home now?" I replied, "The door is not locked," and hung up. I began to think about what was coming, and I realized that the only way to deal with it was to harden my heart, let out my anger, and demand answers. From the day I met Lisa, I never raised my voice to her, and I never felt anything but love for her. About 20 minutes later, she walked through the front door. Sitting in the kitchen, I could watch her. She looked around nervously, as if hoping to see Maddie. Finally, she walked slowly across the living room, throwing her coat on a chair. She saw me at the dining table where I often worked, with my briefcase and business documents in front of me. We both looked at each other in silence for several minutes. Finally, I said, "Sit down." She sat down on a chair and asked, "Where's Maddie?" "She's with my parents. They'll be looking after her tonight." Lisa nodded slowly. She looked carefully at my face. "For the first time in many years, I see you clean-shaven." "It's time," I said simply. Lisa looked exhausted, as if she had not slept. The makeup was all washed off, and her eyes were red and swollen. "Whose car is in the driveway?" "My brother. He's using the truck to help someone move over the weekend." After everything that could be discussed was exhausted, we sat in silence for several minutes. Lisa could hardly look me in the eye. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "Alan, what you saw last night is not what it seems." I just stared at her in bewilderment. Was she really going to try to get out of it with lies? It's clear. I pulled our address pad out from under the stack of papers and opened it to the Z section, holding it in front of her. I pointed to the initials she had written there. Jerry Drew is a broker, Sharon Hughes is a real estate agent, and Steve Ostrander owns his own auto repair shop. Do you think honesty is important to them? Do you think any of them would lie under oath if they were called to testify in a divorce proceeding? The shock on her face gave way to tears. She covered her face with her hands and leaned over the table. "Oh, God, no." I was there from the moment you arrived at the club to the moment you read my note. I know where you were going and who you were with. I just didn't have the strength to follow you to his van." I watched her shake her head in disbelief. "Lisa, I want to hear the truth from you, the whole truth. From the beginning of our marriage until today. If you try to lie to me, I will find out. Many things have become clear to me this week, and I want to know everything." I almost screamed in her face as I finished. Lisa shrank in her chair and turned away from me. She started to get up, but I grabbed her wrists. "Sit down. You won't get away from this, and from me too." She collapsed back into the chair and covered her face with her hands, refusing to look at me. I stood up and poured some vodka and tomato juice into a glass and placed it in front of her. I wanted her to speak up and speak frankly. I knew she couldn't handle conflict. This, combined with emotional shock and a little vodka, I hoped, would help reveal the truth. After a while, she lowered her hands and looked at me pleadingly. "Alan, please. I love you." She closed her eyes and shook her head from side to side. "God, I never thought this would happen." "What? That you'll cheat on me or get caught? I think I know which." She started crying again. I waited a little. Finally, I said, "Tell me about Dan Burris." She began to wipe her eyes and took a sip. Almost in a whisper, she said, "I met Dan at a club. He was one of the guys in the group that we always sat with. We danced a lot together and just felt a mutual attraction." "That's certainly putting it mildly," I said sharply. "When did you start sleeping with him?" She flinched when I said this. She turned away from me and said slowly, "We started sleeping together around June. He is married, they have no children. He is older than us. He and his wife have an open marriage." "And I'm sure you just forgot to tell him that you and I don't have an open marriage." "Really?" Lisa didn't say anything. "Come on, Lisa, you're missing something important, aren't you? He makes a lot of money. He wears expensive clothes. He and his wife have expensive cars and live in a very expensive house." She looked at me in shock. "How? How did you know?" "I've been working on it a little. This is a select group of people you found yourself in, a completely different life than ours, or at least than mine." She gulped down the rest of her drink, and I stood up to pour her another. "Tell me, where did this dream happen, and how often?" She dropped her head into her hands. She started speaking so quietly that I had to strain my ears to hear. "Usually, every time after the club, we would go to his van and, she trailed off. "What? Is it hard for you to describe it? Have fun? Or even make love?" "After what I saw last night, it's obvious that you are lovers," I said bitterly. "Anyway, it's too late to try to spare my feelings." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "What do you want me to say, Alan?" "I want you to say sorry, or it was a mistake," I screamed. "But an affair that lasts for almost 6 months is not a mistake, is it? And the only thing you regret is that you got caught." She started crying again and didn't say a word. "Where else did you go? To his house? To our house? To hotels, motels?" She wiped her nose and took another sip. "We've been to his house once, to a motel a couple times, but never to our house." "In his house and in his bed?" I asked. She simply nodded. "Where was Mrs. Dan?" "She was away for the weekend." "What else, Lisa? Come on, don't be shy. I'm sure there's something else." She was silent for several minutes, nervously clutching her glass and looking into it. "We met for lunch sometimes. No sex, just lunch." Quietly, I asked, "Anything else?" She shook her head. I slammed my fist on the table. "You're forgetting about your weekend on the sailing yacht." I didn't think Lisa could turn any more pale, but she was clearly on the verge of fainting. I grabbed her as she began to sink to the floor. Recovering, she took a sip of her drink, put her head in her hands, and began to cry again. Finally, she whispered, How did you know about this?" Shaking my head, I said, "Lisa, do you understand? You were caught. You were given away. There are no more secrets." Now tell me about that weekend when you were too busy with work to go north with your husband and daughter. A trembling Lisa wrapped her arms around herself. Dan has a friend who has a sailboat docked in Saugatuck. He invited Dan and I and Connie and her boyfriend to go sailing for the weekend. You were already planning on working for your parents, so I said that I have to work to go, and you took Maddie with you. I looked at her with disgust. I guess you weren't afraid to outright lie to me anymore. And how ironic that you practically refused to get on a boat on the tiny lake where Mom and Dad have a house, but you're willing to spend the weekend sailing on Lake Michigan. Without looking at me, she said, "We didn't really swim much. The water was calm, and we sailed along the coast and anchored about half a mile offshore. I also drank a few cocktails, which helped me relax." I just stared at her. So what were you doing on a yacht at anchor, with such privacy and complete relaxation? Running around the boat naked and having wild sex with everyone? Almost stuttering, she said, We, we sunbathed naked, but I only had sex with Dan in the cabin a couple of times." She fell silent for a second, and I continued to look at her silently, and then later, when Dan and I stayed overnight on the yacht in the marina. Then, closing her eyes, she added, "And again when we went to sea on Sunday." I felt a sharp pain in my stomach when I remembered that we had not made love that Sunday evening when I returned home. In fact, Lisa went to bed early, saying she wasn't feeling well. The only time I remember is that we missed the weekend when she didn't have women's days. Now I know why. Sarcastically, I said, "Wow, what a sex-filled weekend. You just don't have any energy left to share with your poor husband, who hasn't seen his loving wife for 3 days." Lisa didn't say anything. She just started crying and shaking her head again. We sat for a while, Lisa quietly sobbing, and I was lost in my thoughts. Finally, I stood up and poured her another drink, placing it in front of her. I no longer had to force myself to be angry. I was angry. Lisa looked at me tiredly. "Please, I need to lie down." Lisa's voice trembled, and she could hardly hold the glass in her hands. Her words began to slur, and I realized that fatigue and alcohol were beginning to affect her. I looked at her gloomily. "We're not done yet, Lisa. We're not done yet." Crying, she said, "Please, I told you everything." Somehow, I doubt it. It occurred to me that perhaps you so easily entered into this long-term affair and hid it because this is not your first betrayal. Have you cheated on me before? Lisa looked at me with her mouth open, trying to say something. She then closed it and turned away, trying to speak again. It was obvious that she was trying to figure out how much she could get out of it, and in her condition, it was a difficult task. I shook my head. "Lisa, don't try to lie to me again. It won't work. Other people told me about you for years, but I didn't believe them. I refuse to believe it. Not my loving wife. I want to know everything, and I want to know now." Lisa fell back into her chair, her eyes dull and half closed. Exhaustion and defeat were written on her face and in her posture. In a monotone voice, she said, "Before Dan, I dated another guy from the club. Just a couple of times, and then he stopped going there." I kind of assumed it based on what the caller said, but I wasn't interested. I said calmly, "Before that, Lisa." Lisa closed her eyes and sobbed quietly. "The year before you started the business, I had an affair with a couple of guys while you were working nights at the factory." "And who were they?" She opened her eyes and whispered, "You know, don't you?" I gritted my teeth and said, "Tell me." She said, "John and Craig." I almost physically felt how this piece of the puzzle fell into place. Suspicion has been swirling around in my head for the past few days. Lisa was probably the most attractive woman in our social circle. And if John and Craig hit on every beautiful woman they knew, why didn't they hit on her? Of course, they pestered me. But Lisa never told me about this. She would tell if they failed or if it upset her. Of course, John and Craig wouldn't tell me about this. But they hinted at it after drinking a few bottles of beer, and I was too gullible to take them seriously. My wife betrayed me. She betrayed me with two people I considered my best friends. And one of them was my business partner. Sarcastically, I said, "Did you study with them at the same time or separately?" She just stared ahead, unfocused. "Do you remember when Craig got pulled over by a cop a mile from here for drunk driving? The cop let him go because he said he was going to see his girlfriend just a few blocks away." I just chuckled. I knew what would happen next. He came and we had a drink. Maddie had already been asleep for several hours. The policeman followed him here and did not leave. He was just sitting in his car in front of the entrance. Craig suggested turning off all the lights and pretending that we had gone to bed. So we and they did. When we went into the bedroom, he started pestering me. Her voice dropped. "You know what happened next." "Yeah, I know." Craig told that cop story a few times, but with a completely different ending. At least when I was in the company. After a few minutes of silence, I asked, "What about John?" A couple of weeks later, John turned up on the Friday night after a happy party. He was very drunk. We sat on the sofa, watched TV, and had a few more drinks. I was sure Craig told John that he had sex with Lisa and that she was easily available. There were no secrets between them. Of course, John immediately went to our house, knowing that I worked the night shift. Lisa began to cry again and rock back and forth, muttering something incomprehensible. "Lisa, Lisa," I had to shout at her to get her attention. "Look at me. How many times have you cheated with them?" Without looking at me, she said quietly, "Craig came a couple of times after the first time it happened. But then you started talking about what kind of players they were and mentioned all their adventures. I got scared and told them both not to come again." Now I was really starting to doubt whether Lisa had ever been faithful to me. I sat and thought about it. At random I said, "When was I in the army? Tell me about it, Lisa." She looked at me pleadingly. "Alan, please, don't force me." "Tell me, Lisa, tell me now." I saw her withdraw into herself, unable to resist any longer. "One day, while you were on patrol at the border, Ken Machado came to take a picture of Maddie. She looked at me in despair. "Alan, we've had sex every night since I got there. You've been away for 4 or 5 days." Ken Machado was a soldier from another unit whom we met when we first arrived in Germany. He and his wife had a boy about Maddie's age. We met a few times for dinner and for the kids to play before his wife returned to the States. I heard they were having problems at the time she left. Now I know why. "And after that?" I asked quietly. "He came once or twice every time you were on rotation at the border." "Well, that explains why he still calls a couple times a year and invites us to visit New Orleans," I remarked sarcastically. Lisa collapsed on her hands on the table and started crying again. I just looked at her. I was sure there was more, but I didn't think she would be able to speak clearly. And honestly, I don't think I could stand it. After a while, Lisa stopped crying and did not move anymore. I think she fell asleep. I just sat there, stunned and lost in thought. Finally, I stood up and shook her hand. I said, "Lisa, get up. Get up and get yourself in order." She finally came to her senses, pulled herself out of the chair, and, without looking at me, walked down the corridor to the bathroom. When I heard the shower water turn off, I reached into my briefcase and turned off the recorder. Realizing what I had just heard, I ran outside, opened the sliding glass door, got down on my knees, and vomited into the snow. Wiping my lips with my hand, I closed the door, leaned weakly against the wall, and closed my eyes. What she told me was far worse than I could ever imagine. What happened to the woman I thought I married? As I sat there reflecting on the last 6 years, I felt such a fool. I wonder how I even got through the day. God, what a fool I was. My wife was not who I thought she was, and my friends were not friends. I knew there was no way out of this, and that my whole life would change. While I was sitting and thinking, I heard the shower turn off, and Lisa went into the bedroom. Finally, I got to my feet and walked down the corridor. Lisa was lying across the bed on her stomach, naked and sleeping. A week ago, I would have jumped into bed with her that very second. But the realization that I was just one of many with whom she shared herself made me turn away in disgust. I returned to the living room and threw myself on the sofa. A few minutes later, I fell asleep. When I woke up a couple of hours later, everything was quiet. I got up and made myself something to eat. I had just finished my sandwich when I heard Lisa get up and go to the bathroom. A few minutes later, she appeared in the kitchen in her robe. She looked at me with despair. "Alan, please, I love you. I always have." Without emotion, I asked, "Then why, Lisa?" I continued. "You hurt me in the worst possible way. I don't think anyone could hate me enough to hurt me that much. How can you still say you love me?" "I don't know, Alan. I don't understand it myself. It just never felt really wrong to me. I think I liked it when men paid attention to me. And when I did, it felt like I was someone else. Just Lisa, not Lisa Baxter. And you never found out. And it didn't seem like anything that would hurt anyone. And it never changed the way I felt about you, about us." Wanting to hurt her, I said sharply, "Do you know what they call a married woman who sleeps with other men?" She just looked at me blankly. "Woman of easy virtue." Lisa turned pale and covered her face with her hands. "Not just a woman of easy virtue, but a woman who cheated with my best friends and my business partner." "Please, Alan, don't say that. It was almost 2 years ago, and I regretted it." "So what now? Then that was then, and now this is now, and this is an excuse for John and Craig. What about Dan Burris? Do you regret this relationship too?" Lisa looked down at the table and whispered, "With Dan, it wasn't just about sex. We were friends. Please, Alan, we had a lot in common with Dan. Music, dancing, things you're not interested in, things you haven't even thought about." I just stared at her in disbelief. "Are you saying this is the reason you betrayed me and our marriage vows? Of course, by the time you met Dan, it didn't matter anymore." I tapped my fingers on the table, thinking about her words. "Do you want to continue your relationship with him? Is that what you're saying now?" She didn't say anything, just continued to look at the table. "And you think I'll just put up with it?" Finally, she looked at me hopefully. "Listen, Alan, we could have an open marriage too, like Dan and his wife. We would still be together, but we could date other people." "My God, this is just some kind of madness." "Whose idea was this?" I asked slowly. She looked away again, not looking at me. "Dan and I have talked about this a couple of times, but there's never been a good time to bring it up with you." I couldn't hold back and started screaming. "You cheated on me throughout our entire marriage, and when you got caught, your decision is to turn me into a cheater too. If you wanted this, you should have told me before you screwed up for the first time. Then I could decide for myself what I want our marriage to be like and how I want to live my life." Lisa just sat there shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. I leaned back in my chair. "Everything I thought was true about you and our relationship is shattered. Everything I thought I knew over the past 6 years turned out to be a lie in just 6 days. Either you were incredibly smart, or I was incredibly stupid." I shook my head in disgust. I suspected that I knew how much of this was true. I straightened up again. "Lisa, you made your choice, but we all have to face the consequences, you, me, and Maddie. But you were too busy with yourself to think about us, weren't you? Everything revolved around you." "No, no, it wasn't like that," Lisa moaned. "Lisa, I don't know who you are. I'm still in love with the woman I thought I married." I shook my head. "But perhaps she only existed in my dreams. I certainly don't love the woman you have become." We sat in silence for a few minutes while I collected my thoughts and worked up the courage to say what needed to be said next. "I intend to file for divorce. I have already consulted with a lawyer. There should be no problems with the division of property or alimony. I intend to file for joint custody. If you object, I will make public everything you have done in the last 6 years, so everyone will know about this. At least you have proven that you are not a suitable example for our daughter." Lisa fell into a chair and started crying again. I just sat there, staring at the wall, lost in thought, thinking about the last 6 years. about where we are heading now and how things will change. I've been in my comfort zone for too long. I forgot the first lesson in life. Nothing stays the same. I waited for Lisa to gather her thoughts. Her sobs finally subsided, and I looked at her. This could happen one of two ways, Lisa. She looked at me in despair. I can leave tonight and ask my parents to let me stay with them for a while. Of course, I'll have to tell them everything. And tomorrow one of us will have to tell Maddie that I don't live here anymore. Lisa flinched when I said this. The second option is to wait until after the holidays. There are 3 weeks left until Christmas. We can give our daughter as normal a Christmas as we can. That will give us time to prepare her for what's coming, and we can keep it a secret from yours and mine. Families until the new year. I noticed that hope flashed in Lisa's eyes. I knew that she thought that if she could delay my departure, then everything could change. I decided not to dissuade her from this, at least for now. Please stay, Alan. I don't want you to leave. That decision has already been made. The only question is when. Lisa looked away and whispered, "Please, please, let's wait until after the holidays." When this was decided, I had a bad taste and a strong desire to leave. I didn't want to look at her anymore, and I definitely didn't want to talk to her. Suddenly, I stood up. It's decided. I'm leaving. I'll be back late. Without looking back, I went to the closet, took my coat, and walked out the door. I went to the mall and wandered around for a while. In the end, I went to the cinema to kill a few hours and take my mind off things. When it was over, I couldn't say I was watching. I decided to stop at a bar to think about my next steps. As I sat there, eating a greasy burger and fries, I decided that the first thing I needed to do was stop eating that kind of food and start taking better care of myself. After that, end my marriage and leave the construction business, and completing your studies will now become a priority. I returned home after midnight and the house was dark. Walking down the corridor, I heard Lisa tossing and turning in our bedroom. No, I wasn't going to sleep with her anymore. Today, I'm sleeping in Maddie's room, and tomorrow I'll arrange something else. I woke up early and just lay on the bed in Maddie's room, staring at the ceiling. I was struck by the memory of how Lisa and I used to make love on Sunday mornings. Shaking my head, I began to think about what I needed to do. Finally, with a heavy sigh, I got out of bed and went to the bathroom. After I got cleaned up and dressed, I sat down in the kitchen to finish my papers. I realized that I needed about 6 more hours to finish everything. Then I will call John and arrange to meet him on Monday. Lisa got up and went into the kitchen. I just ignored her and continued working while she prepared breakfast and sat down across from me. Finally, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I shrugged. "Does it matter?" She asked, "Where did you sleep?" "In Maddie's room. I'll put a spare single bed in the basement today. I'll move my clothes and dresser there. I'll sleep in the basement until I move out. It'll be better for both of us." Lisa simply stared at her bowl of cereal, then stood up and walked back into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. She didn't go out again that day. Later that day, I set up the bed and moved my clothes and other things I needed into the basement. I cleaned out the basement and tried to make it at least a little cozy. We had old carpet and an old TV that I installed. I connected it to the cable. I also had an old phone that I connected too. I turned off the call and put the phone behind the bed. Lisa tried to avoid me and didn't say anything, which suited me quite well. I went to give the car and camera to my brother. I told him that I would keep the tape for now and we would discuss it later. Stopped by Mom and Dad's and picked up Maddie on the way home. When Maddie burst into the house, she immediately went to her mom to tell her all about her weekend. Lisa was obviously prepared as she acted as if nothing had happened and made all the necessary responses to Maddie's chatter. I followed her example, and we both behaved as if it were an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Lisa cooked dinner, and we all sat around the table as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Thus began my routine for a time while I still lived in this house. When Maddie was home and awake, I stayed upstairs. We did everything we usually did. watched TV, read the newspaper, played with Maddie, cooked food, and cleaned up after eating. But when Maddie went to bed, I spent the rest of the evening in the basement or out of the house. Of course, there were no more manifestations of tenderness between us. On Monday morning, we got up like any other weekday. Lisa noticed that she did not want to go to work. I told her straight up that she would need this job and that she shouldn't lose it. I called John and told him I wanted to bring all my end-of-year tax documents for him to sign. I went to the bank and did everything that needed to be done. I finally arrived at John's house around noon. I knew that his wife would be at work and his son in kindergarten. John and I usually met a couple of times a week during the winter to work on project requests or complete paperwork, sometimes just to spend time together. I walked into his house with a large box full of business documents and forms that had accumulated over 2 years. John greeted me with a big smile. "Hey, Alan, why did you leave so early on Friday? After all, the fun just begins in the evening." Then he noticed all the files I brought with me. "What the hell? Why did you bring all this stuff here?" I put everything on the kitchen table and started organizing the files. "Listen, John. Here are the completed workers' insurance forms, quarterly liability insurance forms, quarterly IRS withholding tax forms, and year-end tax forms. Also here are all the W-2s that need to be sent after the new year." I picked up mine. I wrote out the checks for the insurance premiums and deductions. All you have to do is sign them. I paused for a moment and looked John in the eyes. "Also important is this. Here is my notarized letter of resignation as an officer of the company, effective today. Also here is a receipt signed by me that I received $2,500 from the company in exchange for all my interests in the company. This includes common stock, accumulated capital, and goodwill. I wrote myself a check and cashed it this morning. This may leave you with little money to start next year, but I'm sure you'll find a way. But I think you should go to the bank today and remove my name from the company accounts." John just looked at me, unable to say a word. Finally, his face turned red, and he started waving his arms and shouting, "What the hell are you doing? You can't do this." "Oh, I can, John, and I already have. And if you don't want the reasons for my impending divorce to become public knowledge, you won't argue about it." When he realized what I had just said, John closed his mouth and turned pale. But, I don't know what you're talking about." I just stared at him furiously. "Don't insult me anymore. Now I know all your secrets. I don't want to see you, and I'll never talk to you again. And that goes for Craig, too. If I ever see you two again, I think I can kick both of your asses." As I left the house, I made one last comment. "Tell your wife I won't come to your Christmas party and give me a good reason." When I left, I felt better. This was the first step towards closing the chapter of the past and starting to look to the future. Money also relieved some of the financial pressure, but I still had one more personal mission of retribution. I waited until 4:30 and called the Burris house. I remembered from my observations that Patricia Burris usually came home much earlier than Dan. I hope it was like this every day. A woman's voice answered the phone. "Burris house." I asked if it was Pat Burris. She said yes. Remembering what a shock the anonymous call was for me, I decided to be as sensitive as possible. I said, "My name is Alan Baxter. You don't know me, but my wife is your husband's friend." I heard suspicion in her voice when she asked, "What are we talking about?" "Your husband told my wife that you have an open marriage, so it probably doesn't matter to you. I recently found out that they have been in a relationship for over 6 months, and I am filing for divorce because of this. I wanted you to be aware of the consequences of his behavior." And Lisa too, I thought to myself. There was dead silence for a minute then. "Son of the devil, that son of a bitch. Alan, did you say your name was Alan?" I confirmed this. "Well, we don't have any open marriage. He probably said that because he cheated on me once before, and I forgave him. I suspected him a couple of times since then, but I was too busy with my work to keep an eye on him. Looks like it was a mistake." "Well, Pat, I'm both sorry and glad to hear that. When my wife got caught, She tried to offer me an open form of marriage, like Dan had, as he said. I couldn't imagine living like that. "What evidence do you have of this affair?" she asked. "I have her confession on tape, and I have several photographs of them together at a disco. Not too explicit, but they show them hugging, kissing, and apparently being intimate. I also have the names and phone numbers of other people in their group who knew about the affair." I heard her swearing and muttering under her breath, "Alan, can we meet and talk? I'd like to hear the tape and see the pictures." I agreed, but said that I needed time to develop the photographs. We agreed to meet for lunch on Wednesday. I called my brother, and he gave me the address of a photo studio where they do urgent orders. I called them and agreed to give the film in the morning so that they would develop it by the end of the day. I ordered 2 sets of all the pictures and asked that they be made in 5x7 size if possible. After handing over the film, I decided to go to the university and see if my supervisor could accept me. He found time and we went through my curriculum. We determined that I needed to take 3 courses to complete my degree. All of these courses will be offered during the winter semester and will be offered during the daytime. Since I now have enough money to pay for tuition, I plan to enroll right after the holidays. I was done with that, but I thought I needed more work. Financially, things will be difficult. During the 4 years that I was not on active duty, the Army Reserve and National Guard literally inundated me with letters and calls trying to recruit me. I called recruiters from both organizations to see what they had to offer. The Guard offered me a 1-year contract at my old rank, and since I had experience in the service, I would receive a bonus of $500. Half will be paid at signing and the rest at the end of the year. $500 would cover almost half of the divorce costs, so it was a good option. 1 working Saturday a month will bring in almost $200. The position I was offered was an administrative one at state headquarters, which was less than 10 miles from home. I thought, damn, 1 Saturday a month and 2 weeks next summer is worth it. I accepted the offer and made an appointment to complete the paperwork later in the week. As things started to get back in order, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. The next day, there was a meeting with Pat Burris. I took the photos and went to the restaurant. When I walked in, I saw a woman standing at the cash register, looking at the door. I guessed it was her, so I walked up and said, "Pat." She smiled discreetly and said, "You must be Alan." I nodded and offered to find a table. As we walked to the table, I noticed that she was approximately 5'8", blonde, attractive, and very slim. She was dressed in a formal business casual manner and appeared to be older than Dan, perhaps in her 30s with a little. When we sat down, we began to carefully study each other. Finally, I offered to place an order so that we could discuss the matter later. While we waited for the food, I gave her some information about myself, Lisa, and Maddie. She shook her head when she heard that we had a daughter. She told me about herself and Dan. They met in college. She studied 2 years older than him. After she completed her studies, they got married and she started her own business. Eventually, he went into sales. From the very beginning, they decided that they did not want to have children. They had been married for over 10 years. After the food arrived, I began to tell her my story from the moment I received the call until the morning of my confrontation with Lisa. I gave her a copy of the list of names and phone numbers from our address book. Then I took out the recorder and started recording. She listened intently as the tape played Lisa's confession of her affair with Dan. Her face tensed when she heard that they were meeting at her house. When the part about Dan was over, I turned off the recording. I didn't see the need for her to hear the rest. Then I took out the photographs and talked about what I saw in the club. The photographs showed them quite clearly holding hands, kissing and caressing each other. Their faces expressed the same thing as those of 2 lovers, completely immersed in their feelings. Pat had tears in her eyes when she finally put the photos down. "Thank you, Alan. Can I keep these photos?" I said they were hers. Pat dried her eyes and, gathering her courage, said, "5 years ago, Dan had an affair that I found out about. We almost got divorced because of it, but he convinced me that it was over and would not happen again. Over the years, I suspected him several times, but everything always came to naught. Finally, she looked down at the table and sighed, but this time it's the last straw. I don't need it, and I don't need him. She looked at me with sympathy. I feel sorry for your marriage and your daughter. I could see that she was suffering and trying to hold on. I knew exactly how she felt. It's not your fault. They're adults, and they made their choice. Now all we have to do is pick up the pieces and move on. When, as it seemed to us, everything that needed to be said had already been said, we stood up to leave. I gave her my phone number and told her to call if she needed anything or just to let her know how things were going. She smiled and said, "Thank you. Sometimes it's nice to know there's someone who understands what you're going through." While I was dealing with things during the week, in public we continued to pretend that everything was fine with us. Lisa tried to keep a smile on her face when she was around Maddie, but when she left the room, her face took on an exhausted look. At night, I heard her crying in the bedroom after she went to bed. I felt a kind of guilty satisfaction that perhaps she felt some of the pain that I felt. Several times Lisa tried to talk to me about our marriage and divorce, but I simply walked away from her. Finally, she gave in. I only talked to her about Maddie, paying bills, chores, or Christmas. I shocked her when I told her I had joined the National Guard. I also said I would no longer be in the construction business, and she didn't ask any more questions. I called the lawyer and instructed him to continue filing for divorce due to irreconcilable differences. I said that I would bring him a check for the advance at the end of the week. He said he would call when the papers were ready for delivery and I could decide how best to do it. Before I went down to the basement on Thursday night, I asked Lisa if she planned for me to babysit Maddie on Friday night. Lisa turned away and said, "No, it's over, Alan. I won't do that anymore." I just looked at her, shrugged and said, "Whatever you say," and turned to go downstairs. In desperation, she grabbed my hand and said, "Wait, Alan, don't go. I need to tell you something." I stopped and just looked at her. Taking a deep breath, she said, "I wanted you to know that I'm starting therapy next week. There's a psychiatrist I know at the hospital who has agreed to see me. I'll be going once a week at lunchtime. I've ruined everything, and I don't understand why. I know there's something wrong with me and I need to find out." Finally, she looked at my face with tears in her eyes. I just wanted you to know." I didn't know what to say, so I finally said, "Okay, Lisa, that's probably right. I wish you good luck." And I turned and went down to the basement. I didn't think therapy would change anything for us. What she did was so egregious, so painful, that I couldn't imagine ever forgetting it. Most nights I tossed and turned in bed, tormented by the vision of what she had done. Finally, after a couple of hours, I fell asleep from exhaustion. School ended and preparations for Christmas began. It was hard to get into the holiday spirit, but Maddie finally talked us into putting up a tree and decorating the house. Lisa and I agreed to give each other one gift each so as not to arouse Maddie's suspicion. We also decided to honor our tradition of filling Christmas stockings with candy and small personal items. Maddie always got excited about all three of us emptying out the contents of our stockings on Christmas morning so she could see what we each got. We have limited our social events to family gatherings only. Some of our friends kept calling and asking why we weren't coming to holiday parties. John's wife, Karen, called Lisa and was persistent in trying to figure out why we couldn't come to their party. We came up with various excuses and tried to minimize any discussion of this issue. I think Lisa shared her feelings with her sister, as there were some awkward moments in her family. My mother noticed that something was wrong with Lisa, that she was losing weight, and asked me about it. I just shrugged and said she had been battling some kind of illness for a while now. I don't think she believed it, but she didn't say anything else. Finally, we made it through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Maddie had a wonderful Christmas, and we spoiled her as usual. I tried to cherish every moment I spent with her, and several times she asked me why I was looking at her so strangely. One day she asked about it right in front of both of us, and Lisa noticed tears in my eyes. She turned away with a sob and left the room. A couple of days after Christmas, my lawyer called me to tell me that the divorce papers were ready. I told him to serve them. They will probably be published in the newspaper next week and become public domain. I decided to stop by and pick up a copy for Lisa to hand it over in person. I thought about giving them to her in public to add to the pain, but in the end, I decided it was enough pain as it was. That same day, Lisa returned from work, apparently upset and in tears. I have tried to separate myself from her emotional state ever since I encountered her infidelity. She said she had something to tell me after Maddie went to bed. Lisa could barely hold on during dinner. When Maddie finally went to bed, Lisa sat down across from me. Dan Burris called me today. I haven't spoken to him since that night. He called to say his wife had filed for divorce. I just looked at her and didn't say anything. He said that she has pictures of us together and that she got them from you. Is that true? I answered, yes. She began to cry. I asked him why divorce if they had an open marriage. He said that's not entirely true. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. He lied to me, Alan. He lied to me. I just shook my head. Lisa, he's a player, and he played with you. He told you everything you wanted to hear. And I turned and went down the stairs. After this, Lisa looked increasingly exhausted and tired. She seemed to be throwing up frequently and had no appetite. I knew the stress was weighing on her, as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought she was developing an ulcer, but she still managed to go to work every day. I looked through the listings, trying to find a place nearby that I could afford. I understood that I would have to pay the rent for the duplex for some time, since Lisa could not afford it on her salary. I eventually came to the conclusion that I needed to find another full-time job if I wanted to rent my own place. It will be difficult to juggle 3 courses and a full-time job, but I will only have to do this for the winter semester. I went to the Human Resources Department of the auto assembly plant to see what they had. I have worked for them a couple of times over the past years and have developed contacts with some of the employees. They had some temporary positions available for 90 days, second shift, if I'm interested. The payment was twice as much as unemployment benefits, so it would be enough for what I needed. I signed up and was scheduled to start work the week after New Year's. The holiday weekend started the next day. I had no desire to celebrate the new year, but I also did not want to stay close to Lisa. Being in the same house with her day after day was killing me. I knew I still loved her and hated her at the same time. I asked her if she had any plans, and she said no. I told her that I needed to get some rest and go away for a while. I was going to spend the weekend at my parents' house. It was cold, but maybe I could go cross-country skiing. It would give me a chance to clear my head. I wanted to gather my thoughts before giving her the divorce papers. I returned on Sunday afternoon. The time away helped, and I felt a little more relaxed. Lisa was in the living room watching TV when I entered. As usual, she didn't tell me anything. Finally, I asked where Maddie was. She said she took her to her mom for the day. I thought to myself that this was probably the best time to do what needed to be done. I went to get my briefcase and sat down next to her on the couch. I took out the envelope from the manila. I said, Lisa, let's do this now. These are divorce papers. You need to hire a lawyer and have him look at them. I didn't file the case on the basis of infidelity, only on the basis of irreconcilable differences. When Lisa reached out to take the envelope, her hands shook and she began to cry. She lowered her head to her knees and began to sob such loud, heartbreaking sobs that tears welled up in my eyes, but I held it in and waited for her to calm down. Finally, she blew her nose several times and dried her eyes. She sat down and looked at me with a gloomy look. She said, Alan, I think I'm pregnant. Pregnant? I just stared at her in bewilderment. Could it be worse? Will this ever end? Slowly I asked, why do you think that? I'm almost 3 weeks late on Women's Day, and I've been feeling nauseous and vomiting almost every morning for the past week. I just kept looking at her. She waited, her eyes darting around, but not looking at my face. Finally, she blurted out, Aren't you going to say anything? I just shook my head. Congratulations, I guess so. Who's the father? She looked shocked and desperate. Alan, it's you. I would never do that to you. What the hell does that mean? I never thought you'd cheat on me. But you've been doing it for over 6 years now. No, Alan. Dan had the procedure 6, 7 years ago. He can't be a father. And how do you know he had the procedure? Because he told you so. Yes. Slowly I said, so you believe Dan, the same man who told you he had an open marriage? Lisa's mouth opened. She tried to say something, but nothing came out. And that means that if you relied on his procedure to protect against pregnancy, that also means you had unprotected sex with him, right? Lisa looked confused. What do you mean? I just exploded. How stupid can you be? Without protection means that you had sex with him without protection. Damn, I just shook my head in disbelief. This is another picture that will haunt me at night. Lisa covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Well, Lisa, when you go to the doctor for a pregnancy test, you better get a full blood test to check for diseases. And in case you didn't know, diseases are sex-transmitted diseases. I'll call the doctor tomorrow to make an appointment. I turned around and walked out of the house to pick up Maddie. This revelation drove me into even greater depression. The whole situation seemed absurd, and I could not come to terms with the thought that my ideas about Lisa were so far from reality. How could I live with this woman for more than 6 years and not know her true nature? The next day, I started working the second shift at the car plant. Classes were about to start, but I managed to get home before Maddie came home from school. I looked after her until Lisa returned from work and then left for my shift. The advantage of my new schedule was that I saw Lisa less often. The downside is that I saw Maddie less often. I also called my lawyer and made an appointment for that day. I told him about the latest development and wanted to know how it would affect the divorce case I was filing. He said that the judge would not approve the final divorce until the child was born and all paternity issues were clarified. Even though I had already filed the paperwork, the lawyer warned me that I should postpone the court hearing until after the baby was born. After filing the lawsuit, information about the divorce appeared in the newspaper. I didn't tell Lisa about this. The next day, she called me from work, crying and screaming. How could you? How could you do this to me? She hung up without letting me answer. When Lisa came home that night, she didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything either. The next day, my father called. He said that he and my mother saw the news about the divorce and wanted to know what was going on. I replied that I wasn't ready to talk about it yet, but as soon as I felt that I could, I would come to them. Over the next few days, several of my close friends from our old circle called. They wanted to know details about the divorce and what happened. I told them I couldn't talk about it yet because it was too painful. They said that all our friends were simply in shock and could not understand how this happened because we seemed so happy. I simply answered, anything can happen, and added that sooner or later the truth will come out, but now I have nothing to add. About midweek, I decided to call Pat Burris. When she answered, I said, "Hi, this is Alan. I wanted to know how you are." She replied, "It's been hard, but it's getting better. I filed for divorce and Dan is moving out this weekend." Yes, I heard. Dan called Lisa and told her the news. It hit her hard when she found out that you didn't have an open marriage. I sighed. Calling my wife a simpleton is putting it mildly. "How are things going with you?" asked Pat. "Well, I filed for divorce too, but we have a complication. Lisa thinks she's pregnant." "Damn, I guess this changes everything. What are you going to do now?" "I don't know. Lisa claims I'm the father, but it turns out she and Dan were having unprotected sex this whole time. That goes for you too. You might need to get tested too." "Damn, he's just as stupid as she is. Yes, I really need to get tested. I'm sure Lisa isn't the only one he's had an affair with. I'll get revenge on him for this. But if it makes you feel better, I can clarify that Dan is not capable of this. He had the procedure about 6 years ago, around the time I found out he cheated on me for the first time. I guess he thought it would give him the right to cheat without consequences. Yes, that's what Dan told Lisa, but I wasn't sure I could trust everything he told her. I thought for a moment. Could you please make a copy of his medical report on the procedure and send it to me? Of course. We should have all these documents in our medical files. I'll make a copy and send it to you. We agreed to call next week to compare test results and said goodbye. I barely spoke to Lisa for the rest of the week. She came home from work just as I was leaving for my shift. When I returned from work after midnight, Lisa was already asleep. She got up early in the morning to take Maddie to school on her way to work. I got up a couple of hours later to catch classes at the university. After class, I would pick up Maddie and spend a couple of hours with her until Lisa returned. And on Saturday and Sunday, I had my first National Guard training camp. On Saturday night, the three of us sat down to dinner together for the first time all week. Maddie missed me a lot and made that clear. She was delighted with my shape and new short haircut. We spent the whole evening playing together until she went to bed. I was so exhausted that I went to bed as soon as Maddie fell asleep. Lisa stopped me. "Alan, we haven't talked all week. We need to talk." "No, you need to talk. And I need to sleep. Let's do this. You think about what you want to talk about, and tomorrow, when I return after getting ready, we'll discuss everything that's on your mind." Then I went to bed. The benefit of being so tired was that I no longer lay awake worrying about Lisa cheating or thinking about the fact that I hadn't had sex with anyone in 6 weeks. On Sunday at the training camp, I had time to think about where all this was going, or rather not going. I received a copy of Dan's medical report from Pat in the mail on Saturday. The conclusion confirmed that Dan could not have children. This got me thinking about how Lisa ended up pregnant again. With all this worry, I had completely forgotten that Lisa stopped taking the pills a few months ago. She said they caused her weight gain and headaches. At the time, I couldn't understand why she wanted to give up the pills completely. I suggested she go to the doctor and discuss other options. But she insisted that she stop taking the pills immediately and not wait to see a doctor. This confused me because every time we talked about having another child, she couldn't make a final decision. Now I started to wonder if maybe she stopped taking the pills because she felt like everything was about to come to light. Was she afraid of what would happen if everything was revealed? Maybe she thought being pregnant would help tie me to her. Perhaps she thought pregnancy was a way to force herself to stop cheating. After Maddie went to bed that night, Lisa and I sat down at the table and I gave her a chance to speak. Nervous, she continued to wring her hands. "I have an appointment with the doctor tomorrow. I wanted you to know." She cleared her throat. "I called Dan a few days ago. I asked him about the procedure again. He laughed when I said you doubt the baby's paternity. He confirmed again that he had the procedure done years ago." She looked down at her hands. "I just want you to believe me when I say you're the father." I took an envelope out of my pocket and placed the medical report in front of her. She opened it and read it. "Where did you get this?" "This is from Pat Burris. It turns out Dan wasn't lying this time." I thought for a few moments. "Lisa, if the pregnancy is confirmed, I will not insist on a court hearing until the baby is born. My lawyer said that the judge probably will not approve the divorce until paternity is established." I paused, thinking about what to say next and how much I didn't want to say it. "If you are truly pregnant, I will admit that the baby is most likely mine unless the blood type indicates otherwise. And despite that, how hard it is for me to live here with you, I will offer you a choice. I can stay here and help you and Maddie during the pregnancy and until you return to work. Or I can rent an apartment nearby and will help as much as I can with or with Maddie. Anything else you need." Lisa looked at me with relief. "Thank you, Alan. I don't want to go through this alone. Please stay." She looked away again and quietly added, "Could you go back to our bedroom, since you'll be here all this time?" I shook my head sharply. "No, this doesn't mean reconciliation, forgiveness, or changing my plans. I'll just do what's best for our children. Just accept it." I didn't tell her that the thought of sharing a bed with her again disgusted me. Okay, Alan, thank you. I want you to know how much this means to me. She got up and left. About a week after the divorce notice was posted, I finally went to my parents and told them that Lisa and I were having problems and that I had filed for divorce. But then, after filing the lawsuit, it turned out that Lisa was pregnant, so we decided to postpone the divorce. Mom wasn't satisfied with this explanation, but the news about Lisa's pregnancy distracted her. I knew she believed the divorce wouldn't happen because of the child. Mom and Dad had always been good to Lisa, and I knew their hearts would be broken when I moved out. Throughout the winter semester, my schedule remained unchanged. Studying was going well. I've been having a hard time finding time to study, but it looks like I'll finish the semester without any problems. Lisa went to the doctor and her pregnancy was confirmed. Our blood tests came back negative, which was some relief. Maddie kept complaining that she didn't see enough of me. I tried to compensate for this on the weekends by playing in the snow with her, sledding with her, taking her to the mall or to the movies. Living with Lisa and actually being separated was incredibly strange. We avoided each other and tried not to be alone in the same room. Every time I looked at her, I started to get angry again. But I also discovered that I was still sexually attracted to her. The thought of dating someone else made me sad. Plus, I didn't understand how I could do it with my schedule and the fact that we still lived together. I couldn't and didn't want to ask Lisa what she was doing or who she was seeing. Pat didn't know if Dan was seeing Lisa. I assumed that she stayed at home in the evenings, since there was no talk of nannies. About a month after the start of the semester, Lisa came to me at night and we had sex. After a while, Lisa stood up, put on her robe, looked at me and simply said, "Thank you, Alan," and went upstairs. I have to admit that this whole situation has me puzzled, and this continued until Lisa's belly became too big for sex. Once every week or two, Lisa secretly came to see me at night. I never knew which night or what time it would happen, and I couldn't bring myself to kick her out of bed when I woke up and realized she was there. I still didn't want to talk to her, but I didn't get as angry when I saw her. One day, I brought up the topic of Lisa's plans for housing after the birth of her child. Every time I brought up the issue of our separation, she started crying. But I thought she should come to terms with reality and think about the future. When the baby is born, she will need another bedroom for him. I suggested looking for a 3-bedroom townhouse or duplex, or maybe even a house for rent. It would have been better to move before the baby was born and before I left. She reluctantly agreed, and after a month of searching, we found a house in a good school area that fit into her budget based on her income and expected child support. There were even a few apartment complexes nearby that might suit me when I moved. We agreed to move after the end of the semester. It seemed that everything would come to an end almost simultaneously. I would graduate from university, my temporary job would end, and we would move. All this was supposed to happen within a few weeks. I attended National Guard training for about 3 months. To be honest, this weekend was pretty boring and monotonous. The main objective was to prepare for summer exercises when most units would go to Camp Grayling in northern Michigan for 15 days. One of the pleasant discoveries was that there were many full-time employment opportunities in the Guard. I didn't want to work on an assembly line all my life or go back to construction. I decided to find out what options they had. I prepared my resume and started applying for different positions. I found that due to my past service experience and the fact that I was graduating from university, I was being actively considered for various positions. After several interviews, I was offered a position in the central warehouse. The salary was lower than at the factory, but the prospects for growth were much better. I asked to start working after I graduated and moved. At the end of the semester, my parents insisted on having a family party. I was the first in our family to graduate from university, although all my brothers would eventually graduate as well. Everyone was very attentive to Lisa and tried to avoid talking about divorce. With the help of relatives, we moved and settled in a new place. After everyone left, I set up a bedroom in the basement. Maddie was delighted with her new, larger room and couldn't wait to welcome her new brother or sister. She even liked the new school and was delighted with her new teacher. I started a new job and was getting used to the daily schedule and wearing an army uniform every day. Since the holidays passed, I've become something of a regular at the gym. I worked out almost every day at the IMCA, running, swimming, playing racquetball, and lifting weights. Thanks to exercise, my busy schedule, and loss of appetite due to stress, I lost almost 30 pounds. When I looked in the mirror, I was amazed at the changes that had happened in just 4 months. The beard and mustache were shaved, the hair was cut short, even the face became thinner and tougher. It was a noticeable change. Even Lisa mentioned it several times. Returning to my routine, I again began leaving the house or going down to my room in the basement after Maddie went to bed. Lisa and I had virtually no social contacts, with the exception of communication with relatives. I joined the American Legion and started going there once a week with my co-workers. Lisa almost completely withdrew into herself after the divorce became public. I knew she visited her sister regularly and heard her talk on the phone to Connie a couple of times. Otherwise, she spent almost all her time at home. Several times, while communicating with our old friends, I learned interesting details. It turned out that it was common knowledge that the reason I filed for divorce was Lisa's infidelity. This led to suspicion and discussion among our friends about John and Craig's behavior. It seems their wives began to suspect something was wrong, and now the entire social circle began to fall apart, filled with accusations and denials about other alleged infidelities. I couldn't help but think they were getting what they deserved. Lisa was already approaching the 7th month of her pregnancy when she asked me if I intended to be present in the delivery room when she gave birth. I didn't think much about it because it wasn't a common practice when Maddie was born. But a lot has changed in recent years. I asked her which she would prefer. She said she wished I was there. But for this, it was necessary to take a childbirth preparation course with her, which lasted 6 weeks. I decided that since this was probably my last child, it was worth going through the experience. As a result, we spent more time together discussing the pregnancy, the baby, Maddie's school, and other safe topics. One evening, returning from childbirth classes, Lisa, without looking at me, said, "Do you remember how I told you that I started going to therapy in January?" Not sure if I wanted to hear it, I replied, "I remember. I need to tell you what my therapist said about my behavior. Will you listen?" I parked in the driveway and turned off the car. I turned to her and said, "Come on, tell me." She was silent for several minutes, looking out the window. Finally, she spoke. "Do you know what my childhood was like and what it was like growing up in my family?" I nodded and replied, "Yes, I know." She told me about this many times in the early years of our marriage. In many ways, her childhood was quite difficult. My father constantly cheated on my mother until he became too old and sick to continue. He would disappear for several days, and my mother would track him down in bars and take him away from other women. They constantly quarreled and fought because of this. It often got to the point before the injuries. Both of my brothers followed in their father's footsteps in terms of drinking and cheating. Everyone around them knew about it and discussed it. Neither of them was able to save their marriage because of it. She turned to me and looked into my eyes. "My sister got married to get away from her father. The irony is that she married someone just like him. Her husband drank and cheated, like all the men in our family. The thing is, I remember my sister having affairs with other men when she and her husband were separated. I know this because she often asked me to look after her children when she went on dates." Lisa fell silent again for a few minutes. The therapist said that growing up in such an environment, at some level I learned that infidelity was the norm, that it was expected and accepted. Everyone did it. And when I got married, I subconsciously expected that my husband would cheat me, so in my mind there was nothing wrong with cheating first. After all, cheating before they cheat on you seemed like a logical step. She cried again. "And then I met you. You were nothing like my father, and your family was nothing like mine." She wiped her eyes and continued, "But the therapist said that on a subconscious level, I still hadn't accepted that there was a difference between us. Lisa wiped her eyes again. Of course, there were other things. My father never paid much attention to me. He was too busy drinking and having affairs on the side, so I constantly craved the attention of men. So when it happened for the first time in Germany, it was like what I expected. And, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but I loved it. And every time after that, it got easier. Consciously, I knew I couldn't let you find out. Bad things happen when a spouse finds out about an affair, but I didn't feel much guilt. I just convinced myself that you'd never find out and it wouldn't affect our marriage. Obviously, I was wrong. I sat and listened. I wasn't too surprised by much of what she said, but it still felt like a fresh wound that had just been opened. Lisa looked at me. I don't expect this to change anything, but I wanted you to know. And I also wanted to say that sex with others was never better than sex with you. It was just different. She lowered her eyes, and I would give anything to get it back. I thought about her words for a few minutes before responding, "Thanks for sharing, Lisa. But you're right, it won't change anything. But I hope you continue with your therapy." The last 2 months leading up to the birth passed quietly. Summer came, but because of her pregnancy, Lisa could not travel far. Everything was going great for me at work. I was transferred to a higher-paying position that I liked. I went on business trips several times to undergo training and attend conferences. My boss encouraged me to apply to the State Military Academy to become an officer. I thought it was a good idea, but not until the baby was born, the divorce was finalized, and I found my own place. Lisa had already been on maternity leave for almost 2 weeks when labor began. My mom was on standby, and she came to pick Maddie up. I quickly took Lisa to the hospital, where she was immediately admitted. The whole birth process was an amazing experience for me. Lisa's tolerance for pain surprised me. I never expected her to be so strong. When the baby was born, I was amazed at the miracle of this event. When it was over, and Lisa held the newborn baby in her arms, showing it to me, I felt that now we were as close as we had ever been in our 7 years of marriage. We named the girl Catherine after one of Lisa's aunts. I didn't need to know my blood type to understand what was visible to the naked eye. Catherine inherited several distinctive characteristics of the Baxter family. She was a real doll. Later, when the whole family was gathered in the recovery room, I felt sadness at the thought that I would have to leave this baby. Maddie didn't leave Lisa and Catherine's side. She didn't want to leave her sister alone. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Lisa and the baby returned home and established a routine. I found myself more involved in Catherine's care than I ever thought I would be. Many nights I would wake up to her screams and find that before Lisa could wake up, I was already upstairs tending to the baby. After about a month, I reluctantly started looking for an apartment. A few more weeks and Lisa will return to work. When I mentioned that I was looking for a place to live, Lisa cried, but didn't say anything. The hardest part was figuring out how to tell Maddie that I was going to move. We decided that we wanted to baptize Catherine before Lisa returned to work and I moved. I did not tell my family about our separation, and we did not want the christening to take place under the weight of this situation. We organized a baptism at our family church when Catherine was about 6 weeks old. That Sunday afternoon was beautiful and sunny. As we stood at the altar, Lisa held Catherine and Maddie held my hand. I had a lump in my throat and my heart was heavy. The pastor sprinkled holy water and gave a blessing. Our parents, brothers and sisters, and their spouses stood behind us, confirming their testimonies. I've never been particularly religious, but at that moment I felt God speaking to me. He said that these 2 beautiful daughters deserved better than a broken home, more than an absent father, and the thought that perhaps another person would raise them made me tremble. I realized that I couldn't let this happen, no matter what it cost me. And as I stood there, I made a silent promise to myself, to God, to Maddie and Catherine, that no matter what happened, I would be with them until they grew up. I'll be there. Later, after the service, as we stood in the church hallway, Lisa handed Catherine into my arms, taking her bag and diapers. Maddie took my hand and asked, Isn't my little sister the most beautiful baby you've ever seen, Daddy? I looked at her and smiled. Almost as beautiful as you, Maddie. Maddie giggled and beamed. As we headed toward the exit, I stopped, looked Lisa in the eyes and said, Lisa, if you don't mind, I want to withdraw the divorce suit. Lisa just stood there, looking at me with tears in her eyes. Quietly, she asked, Will you come back to bed with me? I simply replied, Yes. She smiled and replied, Then I agree. With Catherine on one arm and Maddie holding the other, I walked out into the warm sunshine, ready to face a bright future. Sitting in the restaurant and watching our friends and relatives, my thoughts went back to that day 19 years ago and all the events that have happened since then. Lisa and I are celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary this week, and Maddie and Catherine insisted on having a little celebration. They wanted to have a big reception, but I convinced them that a dinner with close friends and family would be more appropriate. And no gifts, please. Lisa continued to work at the hospital all these years. 10 years ago, when the hospital merged with two others, she took a senior administrative position with a management company. She was very successful in this job and was happy with her career. I continued to serve in the National Guard and received the rank of second lieutenant at the Civil Military Academy. Over the years, I have worked my way up in the logistics field. My time in command of the company as captain of the ordnance company was a real challenge. Now I am already a lieutenant colonel and recently completed my service as commander of a maintenance battalion. Serving in the National Guard gave me the opportunity to travel all over the United States. I was deployed to Europe twice as part of Operation Reforger and participated in operations in Central and South America 3 times. I have had to leave home for extended periods to attend junior and senior officer courses in Virginia and recently the Commander and General Staff course at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Lisa and I have discussed my frequent travel on several occasions, and she has always said that she is okay with it. She sometimes accompanied me to conferences and professional events when she could take time off. Every summer, Lisa and I and both daughters went on vacation for 1 or 2 weeks somewhere in the Great Lakes. We spent many weekends at my parents' cottage on the lake before they died a few years ago. Lisa's mother now lives in a nursing home. Her father died of cirrhosis of the liver about 10 years ago. The girls made us happy throughout our childhood. They were both good students, experienced the transition of adolescence, and their first dating experience. Maddie took up gymnastics in high school, and Catherine took up volleyball. Now both are adults. Maddie attended Michigan State University and completed her business degree in as little time as possible. I think she chose this university to be closer to home and to Catherine. In high school, she met Mark, a wonderful young man, and they married shortly after her graduation. Walking her down the aisle was the most exciting moment of my life since Catherine was born. About a year ago, they gave us a beautiful granddaughter. Catherine is currently a sophomore at Western Michigan University on an athletic scholarship and is doing great. She has not yet decided on her choice of specialty, but promised me to make a decision by the end of the school year. She plays on the main volleyball team, lives in the dorm, and enjoys student life. She manages to break the hearts of young people, but she treats this with amazing calm. I look at Lisa, sitting between Maddie and Catherine, talking and laughing with a feeling of pride and slight sadness. Maddie and Catherine have always been inseparable, and I'm sure they talk on the phone every day. Lisa is still an attractive, sexy woman and has been a wonderful mother to our girls. Maddie and Catherine inherited many of her traits. We finished up with coffee in the private dining room after a delicious dinner. I knew that our meeting was coming to an end. I sighed and stood up. It's time to do what I have in mind. I looked around those present, Lisa and the girls, our son-in-law Mark, my 3 brothers with their wives, Lisa's 2 brothers with their current spouses or girlfriends. Lisa's sister, Sherry, was also there with her eldest daughter. Sherry divorced her husband several years ago and never remarried. Lisa's friend from the hospital, Connie, was here with her husband. I was never crazy about Connie, but Lisa and her remained close through all these years. My best friend Wayne, who was best man at our wedding, and his wife are here too. Lisa's bridesmaid, Shelley, came from northern Michigan with her husband. Two couples from our old circle of friends were also invited. We continued to communicate with them when the rest of that circle went about their own business. When I stood up, the room fell silent and everyone turned to me. Thank you everyone for coming today. When Maddie and Catherine suggested hosting a reception for our anniversary, I convinced them that a small dinner with their closest friends and family would be enough. I know Lisa may not agree with this, but nevertheless, here we are. I smiled at Lisa, and she just laughed and shook her head. One thing we all have in common is that you have known us for at least 19 years, and some of you have known us as long or longer than Lisa and I have known each other. I paused and took a sip of water. The other thing we all have in common is that you probably know that 19 years ago I filed for divorce. I saw Lisa tense, the smile disappearing from her lips, and she squeezed Maddie and Catherine's hands tightly. I told the girls when they were teenagers that their mother and I almost got divorced once. I didn't go into detail, and I didn't know if Lisa had discussed it with them. And since such things don't stay secret, I'm sure you all know that the reason for filing the lawsuit was infidelity. I didn't need to clarify who the culprit was. There was such silence in the room that you could hear a fly fly by. It seemed like everyone was afraid to take an extra breath. I looked at Lisa. She turned pale and looked at me pleadingly as if to say, "Please don't continue." Shortly after filing the lawsuit, Lisa found out that Catherine was pregnant. Naturally, we postponed the divorce, and immediately after Catherine's baptism, we decided to make peace. You see, we are celebrating not only our 25th wedding anniversary today, but also the completion of the promise I made to Maddie and Catherine. The promise I made in church before God the day Catherine was baptized. I turned and looked at my daughters, seeing the love in their eyes as they looked at me. I promised that no matter what, I would be there for them. I would be their only father, not only in fact, but also in name. I stopped and looked at my family. Lisa sat motionless. Maddie and Catherine were still looking at me with love, but also with some concern in their eyes. Maddie, Catherine, I need to know, was your childhood what you imagined it would be? Were we a loving and supportive family to you? Did you feel there was a lack of something we could have done for you? Maddie and Catherine looked at each other. Then they both turned to me and Maddie said, "No, Dad, except for the fact that you traveled a lot, everything was great with us. We know that you and Mom did everything you could for us. We always felt loved, and we always spent time together as a family. In fact, we had it better than most of our friends. We just hope that we can do at least a part of what you did for our families." Catherine nodded in agreement. With relief, I said, "Then all this was not in vain." I took another sip of water and took a deep breath. Shortly after I filed for divorce, Lisa began going to therapy with a hospital psychiatrist to try to understand her self-destructive behavior. I looked at her and said, "I don't think I've ever told you, Lisa, how much I admired your courage in taking that step." Lisa just sat there, shaking her head, with tears in her eyes. The therapist explained that, given the environment in which Lisa grew up, her infidelity was not surprising and could even have been predicted. Her father was a serial cheater, her brothers cheated, her brother-in-law also cheated and tried to cheat with her. As a result, Lisa subconsciously expected that her husband would cheat on her. I shrugged. Given that belief, it was better for her to change first before I did. Lisa's brothers began to mutter something and looked at me as if I were an enemy. I raised my hand and said, "I'm just repeating what the therapist told Lisa. You can discuss this with her later." So, therapy explained why Lisa cheated. I paused and looked at Lisa, but what therapy couldn't or wouldn't do was make her stop. The only sound in the room is Lisa's moan, full of agony. I stopped and looked at the faces of our friends and family. I saw shock and surprise on the faces of most of them, except for a few that really surprised me. I can see from the expressions on Connie and Sherry's faces that this is not news to you. But however, you have always been among Lisa's confidantes. They both turned away, embarrassed. Turning to my daughters, I said, But what surprises me is that our girls don't seem surprised. Still holding Lisa's hands, who was moaning and crying, Maddie and Catherine looked at their mother with some disapproval, then looked back into my eyes. Maddie said, "Dad, we started to guess about this a long time ago, but we didn't know what to do. Should we have told you? Did you know yourself and just turn a blind eye to it?" Catherine added, "You and Mom seemed so happy. We were afraid we'd ruin everything." I shook my head in amazement and looked at Lisa. "You and I turned out to be really smart girls, Lisa. Smarter than both of us, it seems to me." I paused. Maddie and Catherine tried to console their mother. The others just looked at me, waiting for me to say next. Well, they won't be disappointed. About 6 months after Catherine was born, Lisa and I decided we weren't going to have any more children for various reasons. I ended up having the procedure, and we continued to live the life we had chosen. Imagine my surprise when a couple of years later I discovered that Lisa had started taking pills again. I looked at Lisa. "You really didn't try very hard to hide it, Lisa." After that, it was pretty easy to take a few trips that actually lasted less than I said they would, so I could get home early and see what was going on while I was gone. But what really amazed me was that at some point you dared to go back to the man who almost destroyed our marriage the first time. I shook my head. Of course, he couldn't resist bragging to his ex-wife that he was having an affair with you again, and since I helped her gather evidence for her divorce, she naturally called me. You didn't even think about it when our intimate life began to fade to such an extent that it practically disappeared. Over time, the thought of making love to you became disgusting to me, but you still had everything you needed on the side, didn't it? Lisa, I don't know how many affairs you've had over the past 19 years, although it doesn't matter. But on the advice of my lawyer, and with the help of a private investigator, I have documented several of them, the most recent of which occurred about a year ago. Looking thoughtfully at my daughters, I continued. I wondered if I did the right thing by choosing to stay together with you. Honestly, I still don't know. I was afraid of losing you, Maddie and Catherine. I thought if I could keep the family together, your lives wouldn't be ruined. I was also afraid of being alone, afraid of trying to find someone else to share my life with. But at some point it becomes the lesser of two evils. I bent down and took out from under the chair an old, wrinkled, and stained manila envelope. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of time and the events it symbolized. This is the same envelope that contained our first divorce papers. In fact, I went back to the same law firm, but the contents have been updated accordingly. I slowly bent down and placed the envelope in front of Lisa. I'll repeat what I told you 19 years ago. Here are the divorce papers. You should hire a lawyer and have him look at them. I didn't file the case on the grounds of infidelity, only on the basis of irreconcilable differences. Lisa looked at me in shock, tears streaming down her face. I looked up at everyone present watching me. I know what many of you are thinking right now. Why am I doing this now, and why so cruelly, so publicly? I shook my head. How can you balance the scales of 19 years of humiliation and disrespect? 19 years of knowing that your wife is sleeping with other men, and how many people besides her lovers knew about her behavior? Marriage is built on love, commitment, and trust. I lived 25 years in a marriage without these foundations. Now it's time for Lisa to pay for it. And why now? First, I kept my promise to God to be a real father and raise my daughters the best I could, to be there for them when they needed me. Well, our girls grew up and became well adjusted to. Maddie has created her own family and home, and Catherine has successfully completed her adjustment to college, and she probably won't be returning home again except for short visits. Secondly, we've been married for 25 years, and I'm now 46 years old. Physically, I'm probably in better shape than I've ever been. I still have most of my hair, although it's gone a little gray, and I'm young enough to start over. There's still time to find someone who wants to be with me and only me, who values loyalty and devotion, someone I can love, and who will love me back, someone I can trust. And finally, I was offered a 3-year assignment at National Guard headquarters in Washington. This is a great opportunity for me and almost guaranteed to get me another promotion. After that, who knows? A couple of defense contractors have already expressed interest in my services once this assignment is completed. Anyway, my new job starts in 30 days, and needless to say, I'm looking forward to it both personally and professionally. Tomorrow, I am leaving for Washington for an orientation visit and to look for housing. I will not be returning to our home except to gather things I will need or want to take with me. I looked around the room again, where there were people with whom I had shared both good and not so good moments of my life. Thinking about the first life lesson, I once forgot that nothing stays the same. As Paul Harvey said, now you know the rest of the story. Turning to Lisa, I said sadly, "Goodbye, Lisa. I once loved you with all my heart, and a part of me will always love you. I gave you everything I had, but it wasn't enough." Lisa hid her face in her hands and began to cry. "Maddie, Catherine, hold me. I'm leaving. Take care of your mother. Despite everything she did to me, she was always a good mother to you." With these words, I closed this chapter of my life and decisively headed out, ready to start a new one. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.